Chapter 1. The Tomb's Arrival. The grand halls of the Imperial Museum of Antiquities were alive with curiosity and excitement. Altdorf's wealthiest nobles, scholars, and magisters had gathered to marvel at the latest acquisition, an artifact-laden tomb said to have been unearthed from the far-off deserts of Nehekhara. Its centerpiece was a towering obsidian sarcophagus, its surface etched with hieroglyphs and inlaid with gold filigree that shimmered under flickering lantern light. The scent of incense filled the room, mingling uneasily with the faint, acrid tang that seemed to emanate from the ancient relic itself. Baron Dietrich von Carlsen, the man responsible for the tomb's arrival, stood near the sarcophagus, basking in the attention of the gathered crowd. His voice carried confidently as he regaled his audience with tales of his daring expedition into the desolate wastes. "Behold," von Carlsen declared, gesturing with a flourish to the obsidian masterpiece, "the tomb of Akharekhan, a king of an age so ancient it predates the empire itself. Within these walls, I have captured a fragment of Nehekhara's lost glory for your enlightenment." Scattered applause rippled through the room, though the mood was tinged with unease. Several guests exchanged nervous glances as their eyes lingered on the dark sarcophagus. The etched hieroglyphs seemed almost alive under the flickering light, their meanings obscured, yet brimming with latent menace. As the days turned into weeks, the museum began to take on an eerie, oppressive atmosphere. Visitors, initially flocking to see the tomb, began to dwindle. Those who did attend whispered of a strange heaviness in the air. "Did you feel it?" one man asked another as they left the exhibit, pale and sweating. "It's like something is watching you." Rumors spread quickly throughout the city. Merchants near the museum complained of vivid nightmares, dreams of arid deserts and colossal black pyramids rising beneath a burning sun. A blacksmith's apprentice swore he saw skeletal figures wandering the museum at night, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. More troubling still were the whispers. Low and guttural, they seemed to originate from nowhere, yet filled the ears of anyone brave or foolish enough to linger near the sarcophagus. The name Akharekhan began to surface among dockside taverns and quiet prayer circles. Uttered in hushed tones as though speaking it too loudly might draw unwanted attention. The museum curator, an elderly scholar named Wilhelm Strasberg, was the first to raise the alarm. Strasberg had devoted his life to the study of ancient cultures, but even his vast knowledge failed to dispel his growing unease. His nights were plagued by visions of gilded death and endless dunes, and his waking hours were no better. One evening, as he examined the hieroglyphs more closely, a chill ran down his spine. The symbols, which he had thought static, seemed subtly altered since his last study. What had once been an invocation to the gods now read as a demand. "Return what was taken." Strasberg sought out Baron von Carlsen, who dismissed the old man's concerns with a wave of his hand. "Nonsense, Strasberg," the Baron said, his tone impatient. "You've allowed the desert's myths to cloud your mind. These are mere relics, stone and bone, nothing more." "But the aura, my lord," Strasberg insisted. "It is unmistakable. These artifacts are not dormant. The Pharaoh's seal, do you still have it?" Von Carlsen hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing his face before he regained his composure. "Of course, it is secure in my private vault. Now, I suggest you focus on presenting this exhibit as the triumph it is." That same night, as the city slept, the museum's guards gathered around a low fire in the staff quarters. They spoke in hushed voices about the growing unease within the building. "You think it's haunted?" one guard asked, his voice tinged with nervous laughter. "Haunted," another spat, shaking his head. "Haunted doesn't explain the shadows moving when no one's there, or the whispers." "What whispers?" The man leaned in, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "The name. You know the one." A heavy silence fell over the room. Then, as if on cue, a distant sound echoed through the halls, a faint, hollow moan that sent shivers down their spines. They bolted upright, weapons drawn, but found only darkness waiting for them in the corridors. By the week's end, Strasbourg could bear it no longer. He decided to confront the Baron once again, this time with evidence, a translation of the glyphs that he believed foretold dire consequences if the pharaoh's seal was not returned. But as he approached the sarcophagus late one evening, a chilling sight met his eyes. The sarcophagus was open. The great slab of obsidian that had sealed it shut now lay cracked on the floor, its edges glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. The chamber was silent, save for the faint hum of magic that pulsed in the air like a heartbeat. And then Strasbourg saw them. 2 pinpoints of green fire burning in the darkness within the tomb. The air grew colder. His breath fogged in the lantern light as an ancient voice, low and resonant, filled the room. Who dares to disturb the slumber of Akharekhan? Strasbourg froze, his mouth dry, as the green eyes flared brighter. The silence shattered as the skeletal hand of the Tomb King emerged from the darkness, its jeweled bracers gleaming. The curator's scream echoed through the halls, but no one came to his aid. Akharekhan had awakened. Chapter 2. The Curse Unleashed. The museum was silent in the hours before dawn, its corridors bathed in the faint glow of moonlight filtering through stained-glass windows. The eerie calm was broken by a sudden, deafening crack. The sound reverberated through the halls, originating from the heart of the Nehekhara exhibit, the obsidian sarcophagus. A pulse of green light surged from its core, illuminating the chamber like a bolt of lightning. The shattered pieces of the sarcophagus lay scattered across the stone floor, each fragment glowing faintly with necromantic energy. Within the ruined coffin, the figure of Akharekhan rose. His skeletal form was clad in ornate armor, gilded with gold and inlaid with lapis lazuli. The jeweled headdress of a king adorned his skull, and his eye sockets burned with an unholy green fire. A faint mist of sand and decay swirled around him, a manifestation of his ancient power. The Tomb King stretched his bony fingers, the crackling of ancient joints echoing in the chamber. His voice, low and guttural, carried the weight of millennia as he spoke in Nehekhara, his words imbued with a command that resonated through the treasures scattered around him. "Rise, my servants. Your king called." From the treasures displayed in the museum, a golden chest, ceremonial weapons, and gilded urns, came a stirring. Skeletons, long dormant, began to claw their way free from their ornamental resting places. Bones clattered as they reassembled themselves, skeletal warriors rising from beneath layers of treasure and dust. They moved with unnatural purpose, their empty sockets aglow with Akharekhan's necromantic will. The museum guards were the first to encounter the reanimated horrors. Roused by the commotion, they charged into the exhibit hall, torches and halberds at the ready. "Halt!" one of them bellowed, though his voice quavered at the sight of the skeletal host gathering around the Tomb King. "In the name of the Emperor, you will—" His words were cut short as Akharekhan raised his staff, a shaft of obsidian crowned with a glowing scarab. A surge of green energy erupted from the artifact, striking the guard square in the chest. His armor blackened and crumbled as his body disintegrated into ash. The other guards hesitated, their courage faltering. The skeletal warriors advanced, their ancient blades cutting through flesh and steel with merciless precision. The hall filled with the screams of dying men and the clash of metal, but the fight was one-sided. Each guard that fell was immediately replaced by another of Akharekhan's skeletal minions, their lifeless bodies rising to join the ranks of the undead. As the slaughter unfolded, Akharekhan moved purposefully through the chaos. His gaze swept the chambers, settling on key fragments of his lost regalia displayed in glass cases, the scimitar of eternal sands, the crown of Akharekhan, and the staff of the Black Sun. Each piece radiated faintly with magic, fragments of his once great power that had been torn from him by the passage of centuries. With a sweep of his staff, The glass shattered, and the artifacts flew into his grasp as though summoned by an invisible force. Akharekhan donned the crown, its blue gemstones flaring with power as it settled upon his skeletal brow. The scimitar hissed as he unsheathed it, its blade shimmering with an unnatural heat that warped the air around it. With each piece of his regalia reclaimed, Akharekhan's presence grew more oppressive. The green fire in his eyes burned brighter, and the mist that surrounded him thickened, spreading like a plague through the museum. The air grew colder, the walls frosted over, and the lanterns flickered and died, plunging the building into near darkness. Baron Dietrich von Carlson burst into the main hall, flanked by a pair of personal bodyguards. His face was pale, but his ambition had not faltered. He clutched a pistol in one hand and a pendant in the other, the Pharaoh's seal, the artifact that had been the catalyst for Akharekhan's awakening. "You dare wreak havoc in my city," von Carlson shouted, though his voice cracked with fear. "I command you to stand down." Akharekhan turned slowly, the green fire of his eyes locking onto the noble. For a moment there was silence. Then the Tomb King spoke, his deep voice carrying the weight of death and centuries of scorn. "You maggot! You defiled my tomb, you plundered my treasures, you think to command me?" Von Carlson raised his pistol and fired. The shot struck Akharekhan in the chest, shattering part of his armor. The Tomb King barely flinched. Instead, he extended a bony hand, and von Carlson was lifted into the air by an invisible force, his body writhing as Akharekhan's power constricted him. The noble dropped the Pharaoh's seal in his panic, and it clattered to the floor. Akharekhan released him, letting him crumple into a lifeless heap. As dawn broke over Altdorf, the museum stood in ruins. Its halls were littered with the bodies of guards and shattered artifacts. A growing swarm of skeletal warriors gathered in the streets outside, their ranks swelling as Akharekhan raised the fallen to serve him. The Tomb King stepped into the morning light, his scimitar held high, and gazed upon the sprawling city with disdain. The land was foreign to him, its architecture crude, its people unworthy. But it mattered not. His goal was clear, to reclaim the glory of Nehekhara and to punish those who dared steal from the Tomb Kings. As the green fire in his eyes blazed brighter, Akharekhan began his march. The curse of Nehekhara had been unleashed upon the empire. Chapter 3. Terror in Altdorf. The cobbled streets of Altdorf bustled with life as dawn broke, the city stirring to its daily rhythm. Merchants shouted their wares, apprentices scurried to workshops, and priests of Sigmar led solemn prayers in the grand cathedral. Yet beneath the surface, an unshakable unease gripped the populace. Whispers of strange happenings at the museum, and a pervasive chill in the air spread like wildfire. It began with the bells. A thunderous toll from the Sigmarite cathedral echoed through the city, shattering the morning's calm. The bells were meant to call the faithful to prayer or warn of great peril. On this day, they tolled without pause, their clangor carrying an unmistakable urgency. Akharekhan strode down the main thoroughfare of Altdorf, his skeletal form a towering figure of regal malice. The scimitar of eternal sands rested in his hand, its blade glowing faintly as if feeding on the terror that spread before him. The green fire in his eyes cast eerie shadows on the buildings around him, and the mist of sand and decay that accompanied him choked the air. The few citizens brave enough to step outside froze at the sight of the undead king, their faces pale with horror. Some fled, screaming, while others stood rooted in place, unable to tear their eyes away. Akharekhan paid them no mind. To him they were nothing more than vermin, unworthy even of his contempt. Behind him marched a growing host of skeletal warriors, their movements unnaturally synchronized. Each was adorned in fragments of ancient armor, their weapons corroded but still lethal. The sound of bone on stone and the faint clatter of chainmail echoed ominously as they moved, a grim herald of the destruction to come. The source of this growing horde lay beneath the city itself. Altdorf's sprawling network of catacombs, long forgotten by most, held the remains of countless generations. Graves were disturbed as Akharekhan's necromantic power seeped into the earth, pulling skeletal figures from their eternal rest. Deep within these catacombs, coffins cracked open and ancient bones stirred to life. Skeletons clawed their way from the dirt, their empty sockets ignited with the same green fire that burned in their master's eyes. Hundreds rose, their movements jerky and unnatural at first, but as Akharekhan's will bound them, they formed ranks, marching upward to join the host gathering above. The city guard, ill-prepared for such a threat, scrambled to respond. Captain Gerhard Stoll, a grizzled veteran of the Reikland regiments, barked orders as his men fortified barricades at key intersections. "Hold the line!" he shouted, his voice carrying over the din of panic. "Steel yourselves, men, for Sigmar and the Empire!" The guards, armed with halberds and muskets, formed a defensive line as Akharekhan's forces advanced. The two sides clashed near a market square, the cobblestones running red with blood as the skeletal warriors hacked through the ranks of the living. Muskets roared, and halberds splintered as the guards fought valiantly. But for every skeleton they felled, two more seemed to rise from the shadows. Maskari Mahita. Captain Stoll gritted his teeth as he swung his blade at an advancing skeleton, shattering its ribcage. "What in the name of the gods is this?" he muttered, his resolve wavering as he saw the seemingly endless tide of undead pouring from the catacombs. Within the city's council chambers, panic reigned. Nobles argued over how best to address the threat, their voices rising in fear and desperation. "Send word to the colleges of magic," one shouted. "We need their battle wizards." "Call for reinforcements from Middenheim," cried another. "The city is defenseless against this horror." At the center of the room, High Priest Helmut Richter of the Sigmarite Cathedral slammed his staff against the marble floor, silencing the chamber. "Enough," he bellowed. "The wrath of the gods has fallen upon us. This is no mere enemy. It is a blasphemy against the very fabric of life. We must act with unity and faith if we are to survive." The council begrudgingly agreed to dispatch riders to the nearby garrisons and mage colleges, but Richter knew help would not arrive quickly enough. The city's salvation, if it was to come, would have to be earned here and now. As the sun reached its zenith, Akharekhan approached the city's heart, his warband swelling with each passing moment. His gaze swept across the skyline, taking in the towering spires of the cathedral and the imperial palace beyond. "This land," he intoned, his voice resonating like the grinding of stone, "is an affront to Nehekhara. Their gods are weak. Their kingdoms are pale shadows of my eternal glory." He raised his staff high, channeling his power. A pulse of necromantic energy surged outward, causing the very ground to tremble. Cracks spread across the cobblestones, and skeletal hands emerged, clawing their way to the surface. The civilians who had yet to flee screamed as the dead rose in their midst, the green fire of undeath consuming what little hope they had left. Chaos engulfed the city as the dead turned on the living, cutting down anyone who stood in their path. Captain Stoll and his remaining men regrouped at a fortified position near the cathedral. His bloodied armor and exhausted expression spoke volumes about the dire situation. "We're losing ground," he admitted to Richter, his voice heavy with despair. "We can't hold them much longer." Richter placed a hand on the captain's shoulder, his expression grim but resolute. "Then we must turn to the one thing they cannot overcome: faith. Rally your men. I will lead a prayer to Sigmar, and with his blessing we may yet stand against this darkness." As the guards formed a desperate final line of defense, Richter raised his staff and began to chant, calling upon the power of Sigmar to banish the unholy invaders. Above the city, Akharekhan watched impassively as his forces spread like a plague, consuming everything in their path. He cared little for the lives of these mortals or their feeble gods. What mattered was the ley line that lay beneath the cathedral, a source of power he could use to summon a portal and return to Nehekhara. With a flick of his staff, he commanded his warband to press forward. The time for conquest had begun. Chapter 4. The Priest of Mor. The graveyard of Mor's garden, nestled within the shadow of Altdorf's eastern wall, was cloaked in an unnatural stillness. The sprawling cemetery, usually a haven of quiet reflection, now exuded a sense of foreboding. The restless dead stirred beneath the soil, their graves desecrated by the necromantic power that swept through the city. At its center stood Brother Elias, a priest of Mor, garbed in the black robes of his order. A silver pendant in the shape of a raven hung from his neck, glinting faintly in the waning light. His face was drawn and pale, his hands clasped tightly around the shaft of his ceremonial staff. Though the winds of death howled around him, Elias stood resolute, a lone sentinel against the tide of darkness. Before him, Akharekhan approached, his skeletal form framed by the green fire that burned in his eyes and the swirling mist of decay that trailed behind him. The undead warband halted at their master's silent command, forming a silent, unmoving phalanx at the edges of the cemetery. "You defile this holy place with your presence, Ancient One," Elias called out, his voice steady despite the tremor in his heart. "Mor's garden is no place for the dead to rise." Akharekhan's gaze settled on the priest, the green fire of his eyes flaring brighter as he stepped forward, his obsidian staff tapping against the cobblestones with each stride. When he spoke, his voice was low and resonant, like the grinding of ancient stone. "Mor, a pale shadow of gods long forgotten. This land reeks of weakness, its faith brittle as bone. You dare stand before Akharekhan, king of eternal sands?" Elias tightened his grip on his staff. "I know what you are, Tomb King. Yours is an old magic, rooted in the rites of Nehekhara, bound by oaths to gods who no longer answer. But your kind cannot endure the light of Mor's judgment." A faint chuckle, dry as the desert wind, escaped Akharekhan's jaw. "Foolish mortal, your judgment means nothing to me. I am eternal. My dominion stretches beyond the reach of your feeble god. Step aside, or be consumed." Elias struck the ground with his staff, invoking a prayer to Mor. Shadows coalesced around him, forming the vague shapes of spectral ravens that darted through the air, their cries piercing the unnatural silence. The sigils etched into his staff glowed with a soft violet light, and the priest's voice rose in defiance. "By Mor's will, I command you back to the sands. Begone, Akharekhan." A wave of dark energy surged from the priest, rushing toward the Tomb King. The skeletal warriors nearest to Akharekhan disintegrated into ash as the magic washed over them, their forms collapsing with a hollow clatter. The ground beneath Akharekhan's feet blackened and split, tendrils of Mor's power clawing upward to drag him back into the grave. For a moment the undead king seemed to falter, his movements slowing as the shadows coiled around him. But then, with an imperious wave of his staff, Akharekhan unleashed a burst of green fire. The flames tore through the priest's magic, dispersing the ravens and scattering the dark tendrils like smoke. "You dare pit your feeble god against the power of Nehekhara," Akharekhan bellowed. "You will kneel before me, as all mortals must." Elias staggered, but did not retreat. He struck again, summoning another wave of Mor's power, but Akharekhan advanced undeterred. The scimitar of eternal sands hissed as it cleaved through the air, its edge glowing with ancient magic. The blade struck the priest's staff, shattering it into splinters and forcing Elias to his knees. The priest raised his eyes to meet Akharekhan's gaze, his voice hoarse but unyielding. "You will not triumph, ancient king. This is not your land. You are far from your cursed sands, far from the power of your gods. You are alone." At this, Akharekhan paused, The green fire in his eyes dimmed slightly, and a moment of clarity seemed to cross his skeletal visage. "Far," he repeated, his voice softer, tinged with confusion. The realization began to settle. This land, with its alien architecture and unfamiliar gods, was not Nehekhara. The sands of his homeland, the monuments to his glory, were far from reach. Elias seized the moment, clutching the silver pendant around his neck. "You are nothing here," he spat. "Your curse will crumble before the might of the living." Akharekhan's momentary distraction faded. The fire in his eyes reignited, and he raised his staff high. "Your defiance ends now, mortal." Green flames engulfed Elias, silencing his prayers in an instant. The priest's body crumbled to ash, leaving only the charred remains of his pendant. Akharekhan stood over the spot where his foe had fallen, his grip tightening around his staff. The Tomb King turned to his undead host, his voice echoing across the desolation of the graveyard. "These lands, they are not my home. But the power of Akharekhan transcends borders. Nehekhara will rise again, even here, and I will return to my throne." The skeletal warriors raised their weapons in silent acknowledgement, their master's will binding them to his purpose. Akharekhan's mind churned with this new revelation. He was in a foreign land, but the magic of this place, the energy pulsing beneath its earth, was potent. With it, he could find a way to reclaim his power and open a portal to the deserts of Nehekhara. But first the city of Altdorf would burn. Chapter 5. The Noble's Guilt. Baron Dietrich von Carlson sat alone in his study, the heavy scent of spilled wine mingling with the faint aroma of parchment and ink. His once pristine desk was now a chaotic jumble of papers, maps, and trinkets from his ill-fated expedition to Nehekhara. In the flickering light of the oil lamps, the artifacts seemed to glint malevolently, their jeweled surfaces reflecting shades of green that made the Baron's skin crawl. It had been days since the incident at the museum. Days since the tomb had shattered, releasing the monstrosity he had unearthed. The news from Altdorf was grim, tales of an undead army marching through the streets, of a skeletal king who wielded dark magic and brought only death in his wake. And the name of the creature, Akharekhan, was being whispered with a terror that sent shivers down the Baron's spine. He took another gulp of wine, but the liquid did little to steady his trembling hands. Sleep had become a fleeting luxury, stolen away by nightmares of the desert. Night after night, the same visions plagued him, endless dunes stretching to the horizon, a golden sun that blazed mercilessly, and a shadow that loomed ever closer. Akharekhan's voice, guttural and ancient, echoed through these dreams, each word a dagger of fear. "You desecrated my tomb. You stole my treasures. You will pay." The Baron rubbed his temples, trying to banish the memories of that cursed place. His decision to fund the expedition had seemed so simple then, a chance to elevate his status among the nobility, to be remembered as a visionary who brought the wonders of Nehekhara to the empire. Yet, as the days passed, the cost of his ambition became clearer. The faces of the laborers who had died in the desert, the screams of the guards slaughtered in the museum, all weighed heavily upon him. "Darn it all," he muttered, throwing the goblet across the room. It shattered against the wall, red wine dripping like blood down the wooden panels. A sudden chill filled the room, the temperature dropping sharply. The lamps flickered, their flames struggling to stay alight. Von Carlson froze, his breath visible in the frigid air. Then he heard it, the faint scrape of bone against stone, a whisper, deep and rasping like the wind over dry sands. "Akharekhan," he whispered, his voice trembling. He turned slowly, his eyes darting to the dark corners of the room. Shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, and the air felt heavy with malice. From the corner of his eye he saw movement. A skeletal figure, wreathed in a faint green mist, stood at the edge of the room, its hollow eyes blazing with an unholy fire. It was not Akharekhan himself, but a specter, an envoy of his wrath. The figure pointed a bony finger at the Baron, and in his mind von Karason heard the unmistakable voice of the Tomb King. "You cannot escape my judgment, thief. Your cowardice will not shield you from the sands." Von Carlson stumbled backward, his heart pounding. "No, I didn't know. I didn't know what I was doing," he pleaded, his voice cracking. The spectre remained silent, its gaze unrelenting. Terrified, the Baron fled the study, bolting down the candle-lit hallways of his estate. His mind raced as he reached the entrance to his vault, the iron door sealed with a heavy lock. With trembling hands he fumbled for the key and threw the door open. Inside were the treasures he had taken from the tomb, the artifacts that had made him the envy of Altdorf's elite. The pharaoh's seal rested on a pedestal, its golden surface glowing faintly. The Baron stared at it, his fear now mingled with a growing sense of desperation. He grabbed a pile of documents from a nearby shelf, maps, notes, and ledgers detailing the expedition. If anyone could stop Akharekhan, they would need to understand the tomb's secrets. Perhaps there was something in these papers, some detail he had overlooked that could save him. Von Constant stuffed the documents into a leather satchel and fled the vault, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He knew he could not stay here. The visions, the cold, the whispers, they would not stop until Akharekhan vengeance was complete. By the time the sun rose, the Baron was gone. Servants whispered of their master fleeing into the night, his face pale as a ghost. He left behind the satchel of documents, abandoned on his desk in his haste to escape. The papers, though hastily gathered, contained critical information: the location of Akharekhan's tomb, the rituals involved in its desecration, and details of the cursed artifacts brought back to the Empire. As the estate fell silent, the spectral figure in the study dissipated into the shadows, its purpose fulfilled. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of skeletal footsteps echoed faintly, a harbinger of the destruction yet to come. Von Karason had escaped, for now, but the wrath of Akharekhan was not so easily eluded. Chapter 6. The Quest for Return. The ruins of Altdorf smoldered under a gray, overcast sky. Smoke and ash drifted lazily above the city, carried by an unnatural wind that stank of death and decay. In the heart of the devastation, atop a broken dais where statues of Sigmar once stood, Akharekhan gazed into the distance. His skeletal form stood unmoving, the green fire of his eyes burning with cold purpose. The staff of the Black Sun, its obsidian head crowned with a glowing scarab, pulsed faintly in his hand. The air around the undead king shimmered with latent power, but it was incomplete, weak compared to what he had wielded in Nehekhara. He tightened his grip on the staff, his bony fingers clenching as he turned his gaze inward. Memories stirred within his ancient mind. The ley lines, threads of arcane power that stretched across the world like rivers, had been known to his priests in life. Their energies could amplify rituals, create pathways through space and time, and even bridge the gap between worlds. One such nexus, Akharekhan recalled, lay deep in the Grey Mountains, a desolate and wild region far from this crude, foreign city. From there, he could summon a portal and return to the sands of Nehekhara. His throne awaited him, his pyramids, his immortality, everything that had been stolen from him by the passage of time and the desecration of his tomb. But to reach the ley line, he would need to carve a path through this cursed land and its unworthy inhabitants. He raised his staff high, his voice resonating with ancient authority. "Rise, my warriors. We march to reclaim what is mine." The catacombs beneath Altdorf shuddered as Akharekhan's necromantic power surged outward. Bones long buried stirred, clawing their way from the soil. Skeletal knights clad in corroded armor emerged from their graves, their rusted blades gleaming faintly with unholy light. Wraiths, cloaked in spectral shrouds, glided silently among them, their hollow eyes glowing with the same green fire that burned in their master's sockets. The undead host swelled with each step Akharekhan took, his power awakening the dead as he marched through the city. The ruins of Altor became a rallying ground for his army, their numbers growing into the thousands. The living who remained were hunted mercilessly, their corpses rising moments after they fell, joining the ranks of the skeletal legions. Beyond the city's gates, the lush countryside of Reikland stretched out before Akharekhan and his warband. Rolling fields of green, dotted with small villages and scattered farms, painted a stark contrast to the desolation behind him. To the Tomb King it was a vision of futility, a fleeting mortal world destined to fall before the sands of eternity. He raised his staff and issued a silent command. The undead legions moved with mechanical precision, their countless feet pounding against the dirt roads. Farmers and travelers, caught unawares by the sudden approach of the undead army, fled in terror. Few made it far. By nightfall, the first village was in flames. Its modest walls and poorly armed militia were no match for the skeletal warriors. The living were slaughtered, their bodies added to Akharekhan's ranks. Those who escaped spread tales of a skeletal king marching westward, a tide of death sweeping the land. In the fortified city of Uberstreik, Captain Reinhard Volk read the reports with growing unease. Riders from the north and east described the same horror, an undead army on the move, its numbers swelling with every passing hour. Refugees poured into the city, their faces pale and gaunt with fear. Volk slammed his fist against the table, scattering the papers before him. The dead march unchecked, and the nobility bicker in Altdorf like children. He growled, "If this continues, the empire itself will be at risk." A sergeant at his side hesitated before speaking. "Sir, what are your orders?" Volk's jaw tightened. "Send word to the elector counts. We need reinforcements, artillery, anything they can spare. And contact the colleges of magic. We'll need their battle mages if we're to stand a chance." The sergeant saluted and hurried away, leaving Volk to stare grimly at the maps spread before him. The Grey Mountains lay at the edge of the Empire's borders, and if the undead king was headed there, it was no random march. Whatever his purpose, it was tied to that cursed range, and it would bring ruin unless stopped. As Akharekhan's army pressed onward, the landscape began to change. The fertile plains of Reikland gave way to rocky hills and dense forests. The Tomb King's progress slowed as imperial forces rallied to resist him. At a narrow pass near Helmgart, a regiment of Empire soldiers made a stand, supported by a detachment of dwarves from the nearby mountain holes. Akharekhan watched the defenders from a ridge, his green eyes narrowing. Their banners fluttered in the wind, bearing the twin-tailed comet of Sigmar and the hammer and anvil emblem of the dwarves. He raised his staff and whispered an incantation in the ancient tongue of Nehekhara. Sand began to swirl around his feet, despite the rocky terrain. The winds of undeath carried his power across the battlefield, raising the corpses of fallen animals and soldiers alike. As his skeletal warriors charged into battle, he strode forward, the scimitar of eternal sands at his side, ready to crush any who dared stand in his way. The march to the Grey Mountains had begun, and the living would know terror before its end. Chapter 7. The First Resistance. The forests of Reikland were shrouded in the faint mist of early dawn, the pale light filtering through the dense canopy of trees. The air was still, save for the faint rustle of armor and whispered orders. Captain Elias Reinhardt crouched behind a fallen tree, his hand raised to signal his men to remain silent. Around him, the regiment of Reikland pikemen lay in wait, their armor dulled with mud to avoid catching the light. Reports of the undead army's approach had reached Reinhardt's command 2 days prior. Refugees fleeing the devastation spoke of a skeletal king, a warband of the dead, and a trail of destruction that led straight to the Grey Mountains. Knowing reinforcements from Uberschreik would take time to arrive, Reinhardt made the grim decision to intercept the undead and slow their advance. "We hold the pass here," he had told his men the night before, pointing to the map spread on a rough-hewn table. "If we can cut off their vanguard, we buy time for the rest of the Empire to prepare. Sigmar willing, we'll send them back to their graves." Now, as the forest around them grew eerily quiet, Reinhardt tightened his grip on his sword. The ground beneath his feet trembled faintly, the vibrations growing stronger with each passing moment. The rhythmic pounding of bone against earth echoed in the distance, a chilling herald of the enemy's approach. The first of the undead appeared as silhouettes through the mist, skeletal warriors in rusted armor, their empty eye sockets glowing with sickly green fire. They marched in perfect unison, their weapons clutched in bony hands. Behind them loomed towering constructs, pieced together from fragments of bone and gilded metal, their hulking forms radiating an aura of ancient power. At their center stood Akharekhan. His skeletal frame was adorned in regal golden armor, his scimitar of eternal sands resting lightly in one hand. The green fire of his eyes burned brighter than the rest, casting a ghastly light around him. The undead king moved with a purpose, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Reinhardt raised his hand, signaling his men. Crossbowmen knocked their bolts, the faint creak of wood and sinew breaking the silence. Pikemen shifted in formation, their long weapons braced against the ground. The captain waited until the enemy was fully within the ambush zone before lowering his hand in a sharp motion. Now, the forest erupted with noise. A volley of crossbow bolts whistled through the air, striking the front ranks of the skeletal warriors. Bones shattered, and several undead crumbled to the ground, their magic snuffed out. Pikemen surged forward from their hiding places, driving their weapons into the next wave of skeletons. The initial assault was swift and brutal, the Reikland soldiers' training and discipline overwhelming the undead vanguard. Gento Young B simulation, instilled in their minds. Reinhardt allowed himself a grim smile as he plunged his sword into the ribcage of a skeleton. "Hold the line! Drive them back!" But Akharekhan remained still, unperturbed by the ambush. He observed the skirmish with an air of detached authority, the green fire of his eyes narrowing slightly as he raised his obsidian staff. Chanting in the guttural tongue of Nehekhara, he drove the butt of the staff into the ground. A ripple of necromantic energy surged outward, washing over the battlefield like an invisible tide. The shattered remains of the fallen skeletons trembled, their broken bones knitting back together. The undead warriors rose once more, reforming their ranks and pressing forward with renewed vigor. Even the Reikland dead, their freshly slain corpses, began to stir, their eyes glowing with the same unnatural fire. "What in Sigmar's name?" Reinhardt muttered, his confidence faltering as he saw his own men rise against him. The Reikland soldiers fought desperately, but their weapons proved useless against the sheer relentlessness of the undead. Each fallen warrior only served to bolster Akharekhan's ranks, their corpses reanimated and turned against their comrades. Crossbowmen abandoned their positions, retreating into the forest as their lines crumbled. Pikemen were overwhelmed, their formations shattered by the ceaseless tide of skeletal warriors. Reinhardt found himself surrounded, his remaining men falling one by one. He raised his sword, preparing for a final stand, when a shadow loomed over him. Akharekhan stepped forward, his scimitar glinting faintly in the dim light. The captain swung his blade in desperation, but the ancient king deflected it effortlessly, his skeletal hand moving with inhuman precision. "You cannot win," Akharekhan intoned, his voice a deep, resonant echo. "Your gods are powerless before me. Your land is mine." The scimitar arced through the air, and Reinhardt fell. By the time the battle ended, the Reikland regiment was no more. The few survivors who had fled into the forest ran for miles, their minds scarred by what they had witnessed. They carried with them tales of an unkillable king, a warlord of the dead who could not be stopped. In the nearby towns and villages, panic spread like wildfire. people abandoned their homes, fleeing westward toward Ubersreich in the safety of the Grey Mountains. Rumors of Akharekhan's growing army reached the ears of imperial commanders, who scrambled to organize a proper defense. Meanwhile, Akharekhan surveyed the battlefield with satisfaction. His warband, now bolstered by the Reichland dead, continued their march westward. The Grey Mountains loomed on the horizon, their jagged peaks shrouded in mist. His path was clear. Nothing would stop him from reaching the ley line and reclaiming his kingdom. Chapter 8. The Librarian's Discovery. The Grand Library of Uberstreich was an imposing structure, its tall spires and buttressed walls a testament to centuries of imperial knowledge. Within its cavernous halls, lit by flickering lanterns and shafts of pale morning light, Magnus Craig sat hunched over a cluttered desk. The eccentric scholar was a man of advanced years, his thinning hair wild and untamed, his spectacles perched precariously on his nose as he pored over dusty tomes and fragile scrolls. Magnus muttered to himself as he scribbled notes on a piece of parchment, his quill scratching furiously. He had heard the rumors, terrifying whispers of a skeletal king and an army of the dead, but where others saw panic and despair, Magnus saw opportunity. His entire life had been devoted to the study of ancient civilizations, particularly those of the far-off deserts of Nehekhara. Now, it seemed, his expertise might hold the key to saving the empire. "Fascinating," he murmured, flipping through the pages of a brittle codex bound in cracked leather. The hieroglyphs within were unmistakable. They detailed the rites of the mortuary cults of Nehekhara, the ancient priests who had mastered the secrets of death and undeath. One name appeared repeatedly, scrawled in a dialect Magnus had rarely seen. "Akharekhan," he whispered, tasting the unfamiliar syllables on his tongue. Magnus delved deeper into the library's archives, piecing together fragments of history that had been scattered across time. He learned that Akharekhan had once been a mighty king, a ruler of unparalleled ambition who had sought immortality through the rites of the mortuary cult. Unlike most of his peers, Akharekhan's preparations for the afterlife had included the construction of vast armies, bound to his will through powerful necromantic rituals. However, his reign had not been without conflict. Magnus discovered references to a betrayal by rival kings, a coup that had seen Akharekhan entombed prematurely. His name had been stricken from many records, his monuments defaced, and his soul bound to his sarcophagus in eternal slumber, until the empire's greed had disturbed his rest. Magnus leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "A tomb king," he muttered, the weight of the revelation settling over him. "An unkillable warlord bound by ancient magic. Sigmar protect us all." The next morning, Magnus left the library and made his way through the crowded streets of Uberstreich. He clutched a bundle of notes and sketches close to his chest, his usual eccentricity replaced with grim determination. His destination was a nondescript building on the edge of the city, marked only by the symbol of a twin-tailed comet etched into the door. It was the headquarters of Marcus Voller, a witch hunter whose reputation for rooting out dark magic was second to none. Voller was a man of rigid discipline, his lean frame clad in the black coat and wide-brimmed hat of his order. He greeted Magnus with a mix of curiosity and suspicion, his piercing eyes narrowing as the scholar spilled his findings across the table. "Akharekhan," Voller said, testing the name with a faint sneer. "The skeletal king marching on the empire. What does this mean?" Magnus adjusted his spectacles, his hands trembling slightly as he gestured to a map spread across the table. "It means we're dealing with something far worse than necromancy, witch hunter. This is an ancient evil, tied to the rites of the Nehekharan mortuary cults. Akharekhan was no ordinary king. He was a conqueror, a master of undeath, and he's come here for a purpose." Voller leaned over the map, his gloved hand tracing the path of destruction that had been reported across the countryside. "Purpose? Enlighten me, scholar." Magnus pointed to a series of ley line intersections marked on the map. Nehekhara's magic is tied to the ley lines, natural currents of power that run through the earth. If Akharekhan intends to open a portal back to his homeland, he'll need to reach one of these nexuses. Vala studied the map for a long moment, his expression hardening. "The Grey Mountains," he muttered. "There's a nexus there, if he reaches it." Magnus nodded gravely. "He could unleash power beyond imagining. We must stop him before it's too late." The witch hunter stood and began strapping on his weapons, a brace of pistols, a silver-bladed sword, and an assortment of holy relics. "You've convinced me, Craig. But we'll need more than just the two of us. An army, at least." Magnus hesitated. "An army won't be enough, Valar. Akharekhan's forces grow with every battle, every grave he desecrates. We'll need specialists, mages, priests, warriors who understand what we're up against." Valar smirked grimly. "Then we'll find them. I've seen what the Empire is capable of when faced with darkness. There are those who will stand with us, if not for faith, then for vengeance." Magnus gathered his notes, a flicker of hope breaking through his fear. "Then let's not waste time. Every moment we delay, Akharekhan's power grows." As the two men left the witch hunter's headquarters, the bells of Uberschreik tolled in warning. Refugees poured into the city, their faces pale with terror, their voices trembling as they spoke of the skeletal king. The tales of Akharekhan spread like wildfire, and the people began to pray for salvation. But Magnus and Valar knew better. Salvation would not come from prayer alone. It would have to be earned, forged in fire and blood, by those brave enough to stand against the tide of undeath. The hunt for Akharekhan had begun. 1/2. Chapter 9. The Defiled Village. The village of Holsendor was a quiet, unremarkable place, nestled in a hollow of rolling hills and dense forests. Its people lived simple lives, tending their crops and livestock, unaware of the doom marching toward them. They had heard distant rumors of the undead king and his skeletal legions, but the horrors seemed far removed from their peaceful valley. By the time the mist rolled in, thick and unnatural, it was already too late. Akharekhan stood at the crest of a hill overlooking the village, his skeletal form radiating malice. Behind him, his undead host stretched into the gloom, an endless tide of bone and rusted steel. The scimitar of eternal sands rested at his side, glowing faintly with a heat that seemed to warp the air around it. He regarded the village with contempt, the crude timber buildings, the dirt paths crisscrossing the fields, the smoke curling from thatched roofs. It was an insult to his memory of Nehekhara. The great cities of the desert had been adorned with golden statues, towering obelisks, and grand temples to the gods. This place was a mockery of civilization. "These barbarians thrive in filth," Akharekhan muttered, his voice resonating like the grinding of stone. "They call this a kingdom? This land is unworthy of conquest." He raised his staff, its jeweled scarab flaring with green light. Behind him, the undead army stirred, their weapons clattering as they awaited his command. "Burn it," Akharekhan growled. "Let the sands of eternity claim this wretched place." The attack began without warning. Skeletal warriors swept into the village like a tide, their blades cutting through the unarmed villagers with merciless precision. Buildings ignited as Akharekhan's magic fueled an unnatural blaze, the flames consuming wood and stone alike. The screams of the dying filled the air, mingling with the unearthly silence of the undead, as they worked with grim efficiency. Fang-slashing walls flared up, fragmenting the village as skeletal warriors swept in at high speed. In the center of the carnage, Akharekhan moved like a dark god, his staff glowing with necromantic energy. He strode through the chaos, his gaze cold and detached. Wherever his staff struck the earth, the ground withered and cracked, the life leached from it in moments. Grass turned to ash, trees collapsed into brittle husks, and the air grew heavy with the stench of death. It scarcely aided the terror he bore, and the cracks turned to humps of ash. The gnome air grew heavy with the stench of death. A few villagers tried to fight back. Armed with pitchforks and hunting bows, they charged the skeletal invaders with desperate fury. Akharekhan watched their efforts with mild amusement. Their courage was futile, their resistance an insult to his ancient power. With a wave of his hand, he unleashed a pulse of green energy, disintegrating the attackers in an instant. Bohemia. As the slaughter ended, the village fell silent, save for the crackling of flames. The ground was littered with corpses, their lifeless forms twisted in final moments of agony. Akharekhan surveyed the destruction with satisfaction, but his work was not yet done. He raised his staff high, chanting in the guttural tongue of Nehekhara. The words carried an unnatural weight, resonating through the ruined village like the toll of a funeral bell. The corpses began to stir, their limbs jerking spasmodically as they rose from the ground. Empty eye sockets glowed with green fire, and the dead joined the ranks of Akharekhan's growing army. The corruption of the land deepened with each moment. The fields, once verdant and alive, turned black and barren. Rivers that had sustained the village for generations dried to cracked, lifeless streams. The earth itself seemed to rot under Akharekhan's presence, a reflection of the desolation he carried with him. As his skeletal warriors formed into ranks, Akharekhan cast one last glance at the ruined village. His disdain for this land burned hotter than the flames he had summoned. These northern kingdoms, with their wooden hovels and primitive gods, were nothing compared to the glory of Nehekhara. He spoke aloud, his voice filled with venom. These lands are unfit for a king. They are as pale and lifeless as the wretches who inhabit them. When I return to Nehekhara, I will bring my vengeance upon those who dare desecrate my tomb. Let this pathetic place serve as a reminder of my wrath. With a gesture, he turned from the smoldering ruin and began his march once more. His army followed, now swelled by the freshly reanimated dead of Holzendorf. The road to the Grey Mountains stretched ahead, and Akharekhan's purpose remained unchanged. Each village, each town would fall before him, and his power would grow with every step. Behind him, Holzendorf stood as a monument to death, its charred remains a grim warning to all who would cross his path. The land itself bore his mark, a scar of corruption that would never heal. For Akharekhan, it was one step closer to reclaiming the glory of eternity. For the Empire, it was another harbinger of the doom marching inexorably toward them. Chapter 10. The Witch Hunter's Crusade. The town square of Ubastreik was alive with the sounds of preparation, the clatter of steel as men and women armed themselves, the neighing of horses as they were saddled, and the barked orders of sergeants attempting to bring order to the chaos. Marcus Voller, the witch hunter, stood on an elevated platform at the center of the square, his dark coat and wide-brimmed hat marking him as an unmistakable figure of authority. His sharp gaze swept across the gathered crowd, farmers clutching old hunting spears, blacksmiths holding freshly forged swords, and dwarves with their gleaming axes hefted over stout shoulders. They were a motley assembly, but they would have to do. "These are dire times," Voller began, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "An ancient evil marches upon us, a tomb king of Nehekhara whose name is spoken in fear even by the dead. He has defiled our lands, slaughtered our people, and raised an army that grows stronger with every passing day." The crowd murmured uneasily, their faces a mix of fear and determination. "We'll not stop until the Empire lies in ruin," Voller continued, his voice rising. "We cannot rely on others to save us. It falls to us, here and now, to stop this abomination before it reaches the Grey Mountains and summons a power that could destroy the very fabric of our world." At Voller's side stood Magnus Krieg, the eccentric scholar who had uncovered the truth of Akharekhan's identity. Krieg held up a map, the parchment marked with hastily drawn symbols and notations. "This foe is unlike anything you have faced before," Krieg said, his voice trembling slightly but firm. "Akharekhan's magic is tied to the ancient ley lines of Nehekhara. If he reaches the nexus in the Grey Mountains, he could open a portal that would bring forth more than an army. He could summon the power of his gods. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd, but Voller silenced it with a raised hand. "Believe him or not," the witch hunter said grimly, "the destruction left in Akharekhan's wake is real enough. Holzendorf burns, its people raised as servants of his will. Do you wish your homes to share the same fate?" The crowd's fear turned to anger, their murmurs rising into cries of defiance. Voller allowed them a moment, then turned to his closest allies. At the front of the gathered forces stood a contingent of dwarves from Karak-Grom, a nearby mountain hold. Their leader, Thrain Ironbeard, was a grizzled veteran with a braided beard streaked with gray. His voice was a low rumble as he addressed Voller. "The undead are an affront to our ancestors," Thrain said, hefting his rune-encrusted axe. "We'll see this king smashed to pieces and his bones ground to dust." Beside Thrain stood Selena Emberlight, a battle mage of the Bright Order, her crimson robe swirling with faint embers as she adjusted the staff in her hand. Her golden hair shimmered like fire in the sunlight, and her amber eyes glowed faintly with the power of Akshi, the lore of fire. "I've studied Nehekhara magic," Selena said, her tone calm but intense. "It's powerful, yes, but it's not invincible. Fire consumes all, even the magic of the undead." Voller nodded approvingly. "With your magic and the might of the dwarves, we have a chance. But it will take more than strength of arms to defeat Akharekhan. He is cunning, and his power grows with every life he takes." As the militia completed their preparations, Voller addressed the gathered force one last time. "This will not be an easy fight," he warned. "Many of you may not return, but if we do nothing, there will be no empire left to return to. Fight for your homes, your families, and the honor of the living. Sigmar stands with us." A cheer rose from the crowd, shaky at first but growing louder as Voller raised his silvered sword high. The militia began to march, their banners bearing the twin-tailed comet fluttering in the wind. The dwarves followed, their disciplined ranks moving with the steady determination of seasoned warriors. Selena walked beside Voller, her staff glowing faintly as she prepared her spells. "Kupper Spilaika!" The journey was grueling, the landscape growing bleaker as the crusade moved closer to the path of Akharekhan's devastation. Burned villages and defiled fields marked his passage, the land itself seeming to wither in his wake. The stench of death hung heavy in the air, and the further they marched, the heavier the tension grew. Each night, Voller and his allies strategized around a campfire, Magnus poring over his maps while Thrain sharpened his axe and Selena prepared wards to protect the army from necromantic influence. "Akharekhan will expect resistance," Voller said during one such meeting, his voice low. "We must outmaneuver him, strike where he is weakest." "And where might that be?" Thrain grumbled. "The walking dead don't tire, and there's no shortage of them." Magnus adjusted his spectacles. "He may be vulnerable at the Nexus. The ritual will require immense focus if we can disrupt him before he completes it." "Then we have a chance," Selena finished, her eyes blazing with determination. "But we'll have to act quickly. Every day we wait, his power grows." As the crusade pressed on, news of their march spread. Refugees joined their ranks, bolstering their numbers with desperate but determined volunteers. Towns along the way provided supplies and blessings from their priests, offering prayers to Sigmar for the crusade's success. Despite the growing strength of their forces, Voller knew the odds were against them. Akharekhan's army was vast, his magic ancient and deadly, but the witch hunter's resolve never wavered. He had faced darkness before, and he would do so again, even if it cost him his life. With the Grey Mountains looming on the horizon, the crusade prepared for the battle to come. They would face Akharekhan and his undead legions, not with the expectation of victory, but with the hope that their stand would give the empire the time it needed to endure. The witch hunter's crusade was ready. Chapter 11. The First Battle. The Rakeland forests were eerily quiet as the coalition prepared for the coming battle. The usual hum of wildlife was absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness that weighed heavy on the air. Marcus Voller stood at the edge of a hill, peering through the dense foliage at the faint shapes of Akharekhan's advancing forces in the distance. The undead army moved in perfect silence, their skeletal forms glinting faintly in the pale light filtering through the trees. Behind Voller, the coalition forces gathered. The militia, their weapons clutched tightly, tried to steady their nerves. The dwarves of Akharekhan, clad in shining mail and gripping massive axes, stood stoically in tight formations. At their center, Selena Emberlight's crimson robes glowed faintly, her staff crackling with embers as she prepared her spells. Magnus Craig paced nervously, clutching a tome of Nehekhara lore, his muttered incantations a faint counterpoint to the unnatural silence. "Remember," Vala said, his voice carrying across the assembled ranks. "Hold the line. The undead will test your courage, but they can be broken. Trust your comrades, and trust your steel." The militia murmured their assent, though many avoided meeting the witch hunter's gaze. Thrain Ironbeard hefted his axe, his expression grim. "Enough talk, witch hunter. The dead march closer with every heartbeat. Let's meet them head on." Voller nodded. "Then let's give them a fight." As the undead vanguard entered the clearing, the coalition forces sprang their ambush. Crossbowmen unleashed a volley of bolts, the projectiles striking true and shattering the bones of the lead skeletons. Dwarven quarrelers joined in, their heavier bolts puncturing even the thickest of shields. The skeletal ranks staggered under the assault, their green-lit eyes dimming as they crumbled to the ground. A war cry erupted from the coalition forces as the militia charged forward, spears and swords glinting in the light. The dwarves followed with a thunderous roar, their shields locked in tight formations as they smashed into the undead lines. The initial clash was deafening, steel on bone, the roar of warriors, and the unnerving silence of their foes. The first wave of undead began to falter under the assault. Militia fighters hacked through the skeletal warriors with desperation, and the dwarves carved through their enemies with brutal efficiency. For a fleeting moment, hope began to stir among the living. From atop a ridge overlooking the battlefield, Akharekhan observed the skirmish with detached disdain. His regal form stood unmoving, his green-lit eyes surveying the ebb and flow of the battle. He raised his staff, the obsidian scarab glowing faintly, and began to chant in the guttural tongue of Nehekhara. The air grew colder. A faint mist of sand began to swirl across the battlefield, carrying with it the acrid scent of ancient magic. The ground beneath the coalition's fighters began to crack, and skeletal hands clawed their way from the earth, pulling themselves free in a grotesque parody of life. The dead rose in their midst, turning the tide against the living. From the ridge, Akharekhan extended his staff and unleashed a pulse of green energy. The blast tore through the coalition's right flank, scattering soldiers and sending many to their deaths. Those who fell did not remain on the ground for long. The necromantic magic reanimated their corpses, bolstering the ranks of the undead. Voller cursed as he watched the line falter. "Selena, now would be a good time for that fire of yours." Selena Emberlight stepped forward, her staff raised high. The air around her shimmered with heat as she chanted an incantation, drawing upon the lore of fire. A massive fireball erupted from the tip of her staff, streaking across the battlefield and exploding in the midst of the undead ranks. Bones shattered, and the flames consumed dozens of skeletons, leaving only ash in their wake. "The living are Sigmar and the living!" Selena shouted, unleashing another torrent of flame that engulfed a towering construct of bone and metal. The undead monstrosity collapsed with a deafening crash, its magic extinguished. The sight of the bright wizard's magic reinvigorated the coalition. The militia pushed forward with renewed determination, and the dwarves roared as they carved their way through the undead ranks. Magnus Krieg hurriedly recited incantations, summoning protective wards to shield the living from Akharekhan's magic. But Akharekhan's patience had run out. The green fire in his eyes flared brighter as he descended the ridge, his staff pulsing with unholy power. He raised his scimitar of eternal sands, its edge glowing with a faint, golden heat, and waded into the battle. The blade moved with inhuman speed, cutting down militia fighters with each swing. The ground beneath him blackened, and the air grew thick with the stench of death. Voller charged toward the Tomb King, his silvered sword raised high. "Face me, abomination!" he shouted, his voice ringing with defiance. Akharekhan turned to meet the challenge, his burning gaze locking onto the witch hunter. Their blades clashed, sparks flying as Voller fought with every ounce of his skill, but the Tomb King's strength was overwhelming. With a single sweep of his scimitar, he disarmed Voller, sending the witch hunter sprawling to the ground. "You are brave, mortal," Akharekhan intoned, his voice cold. "But bravery will not save your soul." Before the final blow could fall, Selena unleashed a torrent of fire, forcing Akharekhan to step back. Voller scrambled to his feet, retreating as the coalition regrouped. Despite their bravery, the coalition was forced to retreat. The undead were relentless, their numbers replenished by every soldier who fell. The Reichland forest became a charnel house, littered with the bodies of the dead and the dying. As the survivors fled into the trees, Akharekhan watched them go, his skeletal warriors falling back into formation. He allowed them to retreat, knowing that the living could not resist him for long. The first battle was over, and though the coalition had fought valiantly, Akharekhan's magic had tipped the scales. His march toward the Grey Mountains continued, and with every step his power grew stronger. Chapter 12. The Artifact. The castle of Everstein loomed atop a rocky promontory, its gray stone walls battered by the winds of the Reichland hills. Built as a defensive bastion during the Age of Three Emperors, it now stood as a shadow of its former glory, manned by a skeleton crew of soldiers under the command of a minor noble. Within its walls, Baron Dietrich von Carlson's secrets lay hidden, secrets that would soon become Akharekhan's. The skeletal army moved silently through the forested hills, their presence cloaked by an unnatural fog that clung to the ground. At their head, Akharekhan strode with purpose, his scimitar of eternal sands faintly glowing at his side. He had felt the pull of the pharaoh's seal, or at least a fragment of it, the moment he had entered this region. Though the artifact had been stolen from his tomb, its essence was still bound to him, a beacon calling him to reclaim it. As the castle came into view, the Tomb King halted, his burning gaze fixed on its ramparts. To Akharekhan, the crude masonry and squat towers of the fortress were an affront to the grandeur of Nehekhara. The castles of these lands were nothing compared to the golden ziggurats and towering pyramids of his homeland. "These mortals hide my treasures in their hovels," he growled, his voice a deep rumble that resonated through the ranks of his undead. "They will learn that nothing escapes the will of Akharekhan." He raised his staff high, and a pulse of green light rippled outward. The skeletal warriors surged forward, their rusted weapons glinting faintly in the dim light. Towering constructs of bone and metal followed, their massive frames moving with grinding, unnatural precision. Within the castle walls, the alarm bells rang out, shattering the quiet of the evening. Soldiers scrambled to man the walls, their faces pale as they stared out at the advancing undead host. Crossbows were loaded, and barrels of pitch were hoisted to the battlements. Baron von Carlson, hiding in a darkened chamber deep within the keep, clutched a golden fragment of the pharaoh's seal in trembling hands. He had taken the piece from the tomb as a trophy, a symbol of his success, but it had become a curse, a weight too heavy to bear. The artifact pulsed faintly, its light a constant reminder of the horror he had unleashed. "He should have left it buried," he muttered to himself, pacing the chamber. "He should have." A deafening crash interrupted his thoughts as a section of the castle wall crumbled under the assault of a bone construct's massive fist. The undead surged through the breach, their skeletal forms cutting down the defenders with merciless precision. Von Kherson fled deeper into the keep, the fragment still clutched tightly in his hands. Akharekhan entered the courtyard of the castle as his warriors overwhelmed the last of the defenders. The ground beneath his feet withered, cracks spreading outward like spiderwebs as his power seeped into the stone. He ascended the steps to the keep, his scimitar cleaving through the heavy wooden doors as though they were parchment. Within, the air was heavy with the scent of fear and death. Von Carlson's ragged breathing echoed through the halls as he stumbled into the chamber where he had hidden the fragment. Desperate, he placed it on a pedestal surrounded by hastily drawn wards, the symbols glowing faintly in an attempt to block the artifact's magic. "You cannot stop him," he muttered, tears streaming down his face. "Sigmar, forgive me." The doors to the chamber exploded inward, and Akharekhan stepped through the wreckage, his green-lit eyes locking onto the fragment. The wards sputtered and faded under his presence, their magic powerless against his ancient will. "You have stolen what is mine," Akharekhan intoned, his voice a low growl. "And for that your soul is forfeit." Von Kherson fell to his knees, unable to move as the Tomb King approached. With a flick of his staff, Akharekhan sent the noble sprawling, his body collapsing into lifeless stillness. He reached out, skeletal fingers brushing the fragment of the pharaoh's seal. The moment he touched it, a surge of power coursed through him. The fragment glowed brightly, its golden surface pulsing with ancient magic as it merged with Akharekhan's will. The air around him shimmered with heat, and the green fire in his eyes flared brighter, casting the chamber in an eerie glow. Outside, the effects of the artifact's power were immediate. The skeletal constructs towering over the battlefield shuddered, their forms warping and growing as Akharekhan's magic amplified their strength. Massive bone fragments fused together, creating larger and more grotesque monstrosities. New warriors clawed their way from the earth, their forms sharper, more defined, and glowing with a faint, golden light. Akharekhan stepped out onto the castle's parapets, the fragment of the pharaoh's seal now embedded in his armor. He raised his staff high, chanting in the guttural tongue of Nehekhara, and the battlefield below erupted with necromantic energy. The land around the castle blackened, the trees withering into ash as the life was drained from the soil. "This land is mine to command," Akharekhan declared, his voice booming across the ruined fortress. "The power of Nehekhara flows through me once more. None shall stand in my way." With the artifact in his possession, Akharekhan's army was stronger than ever. As the undead host continued its march toward the Grey Mountains, the land itself bore the scars of his passing. Villages were razed, forests turned to wastelands, and rivers dried to dust. The Tomb King's power was growing, and with it the hope of the Empire dwindled. The coalition would need more than courage to face him now. They would need a miracle. Chapter 13. The Necromancer's Bargain. The pale moon hung high in the sky, casting a ghostly light over the ruined village of Kaltwald. The place had long since fallen to Akharekhan's legions, its homes burned to the ground, and its people raised as shambling servants of the undead king. Now, the village was little more than a desolate waypoint on the march toward the Grey Mountains. In the center of the village, Akharekhan stood motionless, his green-lit eyes scanning the horizon. His skeletal form radiated an aura of necromantic power, the fragment of the pharaoh's seal embedded in his armor glowing faintly. His army was silent, its ranks unmoving as they awaited their master's next command. The stillness was broken only by the faint crackle of the withered ground beneath their feet. He said, "Joshwepa," the foremouth cried in the distance, standing motionless just beyond the crackle. From the shadows beyond the village, a lone figure emerged. He was hunched, clad in tattered black robes that trailed in the dirt, and his face was hidden beneath a hood. He carried a gnarled staff adorned with animal skulls and dangling charms, its surface etched with crude sigils. The figure moved with deliberate caution, his posture deferential as he approached the Tomb King. "My lord Akharekhan," the figure rasped, his voice like dry leaves in the wind. "I come in supplication, a humble servant seeking your favor." Akharekhan turned his burning gaze upon the intruder, his voice resonating with disdain. "You dare approach me unbidden, mortal? Speak quickly, lest you join the ranks of my slaves." The figure dropped to one knee, bowing his head. "I am Akharekhan, a practitioner of the dark arts. I have long studied the ancient necromantic rites of Nehekhara. When I heard whispers of your return, I knew my path was clear. I offer my knowledge and my service, great king, in exchange for your protection." Akharekhan regarded the necromancer with cold scrutiny. He stepped forward, his towering form casting a shadow over the kneeling figure. "You presume much, Akharekhan," the Tomb King said. "What makes you think I have need of a worm such as you?" Akharekhan kept his head bowed, though his voice carried a note of urgency. "My lord, your power is unparalleled, but this land is foreign. The living have rallied against you, and their magics are unlike those of Nehekhara. I can aid you in navigating this cursed empire. My knowledge of their defenses, their mages, their gods, it can be yours." For a long moment, Akharekhan was silent. He studied the necromancer with the air of a predator deciding whether to strike. The mortals of this land had proven resourceful, their battle mages and priests capable of disrupting even his strongest magic. It was possible that this Akharekhan could be of some use. But the Tomb King did not trust easily, especially not a mortal who dared meddle with the sacred arts of Nehekhara. "You are a worm," Akharekhan said finally, his voice heavy with contempt. "A parasite feeding on scraps of power you cannot hope to comprehend. Yet your knowledge of this land may serve my purposes." Akharekhan risked a glance upward, his hood falling back to reveal a gaunt, pale face marked with black tattoos. "I am honored, my lord. I will prove my loyalty. Whatever you command, it shall be done." Akharekhan raised his staff, its scarab head glowing faintly. The air grew cold, and the necromancer flinched as tendrils of green light coiled around him. "Do not mistake my acceptance for trust," Akharekhan said. "You are a pawn, nothing more. Betray me, and your soul will suffer eternal torment." Akharekhan bowed deeply, his voice trembling. "I serve only you, my king." Under Akharekhan's watchful eye, Akharekhan began his work. The necromancer proved adept at bolstering the undead legions, his crude but effective rituals raising additional warriors from the desecrated remains of the empire's fallen. He also served as a liaison between Akharekhan and the mortal realm, deciphering intercepted orders and identifying potential weaknesses in the coalition's defenses. Yet Akharekhan's usefulness extended beyond mere strategy. He brought with him a collection of grimoires and scrolls, their pages filled with spells and incantations native to the empire. With these texts, he augmented Akharekhan's magic, fusing the ancient rites of Nehekhara with the necromancy of the northern lands. The results were devastating. On the battlefield, Akharekhan began to summon larger, more grotesque constructs, bone giants that towered over the living, their forms animated by a combination of Nehekharan precision and Akharekhan's chaotic ingenuity. The coalition forces, already stretched thin, struggled to adapt to these new abominations. Despite Akharekhan's contributions, Akharekhan remained ever wary. The Tomb King knew that mortals, especially those who dabbled in necromancy, were driven by ambition and greed. He kept the necromancer at arm's length, never granting him access to the core of Nehekhara's secrets. One evening, as Akharekhan prepared another ritual, Akharekhan loomed over him. "Remember your place, worm," the Tomb King warned. "You are permitted to serve only because I allow it. You are no master of death, you are its slave." Akharekhan nodded quickly, his hands trembling as he continued his work. "I understand, my lord. My will is yours." But even as the necromancer spoke the words, a flicker of something crossed his face. Ambition, or perhaps fear. Akharekhan noted it and stored it away. Akharekhan's loyalty, while useful for now, would not last forever. The Tomb King turned away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The gray mountains loomed ever closer, their jagged peaks wreathed in mist. With Akharekhan's assistance, his march to the leyline nexus would be swift, and his power would soon be complete. But pawns, Akharekhan knew, were expendable. And Akharekhan's time would come. Chapter 14. The Dwarven Skirmish. The jagged peaks of the gray mountains loomed overhead, their snow-dusted slopes cast in shadow as Akharekhan's undead horde marched through a narrow mountain pass. The air was cold, the silence oppressive, broken only by the faint clatter of bone and metal as skeletal warriors moved in unison. The mist of decay that followed Akharekhan swirled lazily, poisoning the earth with each step he took. From his vantage atop a bone construct, Akharekhan gazed ahead with regal disdain. The pass was treacherous, its steep walls and twisting paths an inconvenience to his march. He sensed the presence of life nearby, faint and distant, but growing closer. Mortals were watching. Dwarves, he muttered, the word dripping with contempt. These mountain dwellers were no strangers to death, and their halls often rivaled the tombs of Nehekhara in grandeur. Yet their stubborn refusal to bow before him was an affront that would be punished. Behind him Akharekhan approached on a skeletal steed, his black robes billowing as he clutched a staff etched with crude sigils. "My lord," the necromancer rasped, "we are being watched. The dwarves have mobilized." Akharekhan did not turn. "Let them come," he said coldly. "Their blood will feed my army." The dwarves of Akharekhan were not unprepared. Thrain Ironbeard, the veteran war leader who had joined the coalition, had anticipated Akharekhan's route. He and his warriors had fortified a narrow choke point further up the pass, positioning artillery and ranged troops on the cliffs above. As the undead approached, Thrain raised his fist, signaling his men. "Hold fast," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the pass. "These cursed bones will break before our axes. For our ancestors." A thunderous roar erupted from the dwarves as they readied their weapons. Cannons and grudge-throwers lined the cliffs, their crews preparing to rain destruction upon the enemy below. Hidden below the cliffs, squads of ironbreakers waited in tight formation, their shields and axes gleaming in the dim light. When the undead host entered the kill zone, Thrain gave the order, "Fire!" The silence shattered as the dwarves unleashed their fury. Cannonballs tore through the skeletal ranks, shattering bones and scattering fragments across the pass. Explosive charges from the grudge-throwers sent shockwaves through the enemy lines, obliterating towering constructs and crumbling their magic-bound forms. Crossbow bolts whistled through the air, striking true and felling dozens of Akharekhan's warriors. The initial assault staggered the undead horde, and for a moment it seemed the dwarfs might hold the line. But Akharekhan's burning eyes betrayed no concern. He raised his staff high, chanting in the guttural tongue of Nehekhara. The ground trembled beneath him, and a faint wind began to stir, carrying with it the sharp scent of dry, ancient sand. Akharekhan watched in awe and unease as the Tomb King's magic grew. "My lord, such power! It will drain—" "Silence, worm!" Akharekhan snapped, his voice booming over the battlefield. "The time for subtlety is past." With a final word of power, Akharekhan drove his staff into the ground. The faint wind grew into a howling gale, the air filling with stinging sand that swirled in blinding torrents. The dwarves atop the cliffs faltered as the sandstorm engulfed them, obscuring their vision and silencing their artillery. Cannon crews shouted in confusion as the winds overturned their weapons, while crossbowmen struggled to reload as the sand clogged their mechanisms. Below, the iron breakers fought valiantly, their shields raised against the storm. But the undead pressed forward, their skeletal forms unaffected by the gale. The sandstorm intensified, sapping the strength of the living and grinding stone to dust. Even the dwarves' legendary resilience began to falter. In the center of the chaos, Akharekhan advanced, his scimitar of eternal sands cutting through the dwarven line with ease. He moved like a force of nature, each swing of his blade felling multiple foes. The dwarves fought with unmatched courage, their axes biting into bone and steel, but the tide was against them. For every undead warrior they destroyed, another rose in its place. Thrain Ironbeard charged through the storm, his massive axe gleaming with runic power. "You'll pay for the desecration of our tombs, foul king," he roared, swinging his weapon in a deadly arc. Akharekhan met the blow with his scimitar, the clash of steel ringing out above the storm. Sparks flew as the two warriors exchanged strikes, Thrain's raw strength pitted against Akharekhan's ancient skill. The Tomb King deflected a powerful swing and countered, his blade grazing the dwarf's armor and sending him staggering back. "You're brave, dwarf," Akharekhan said, his voice cold. "But bravery will not save you." Before Thrain could recover, Akharekhan unleashed a pulse of green energy that sent the war leader crashing to the ground. The storm raged on, and the dwarves' line began to collapse. When the sandstorm finally subsided, the battlefield was a wasteland. The once narrow pass had been widened by the force of the gale, its cliffs eroded to jagged stumps. The dwarven warband lay scattered, their fallen warriors rising to join the undead ranks. Thrain Ironbeard, battered and bloodied, was dragged away by his surviving kin, his defiant curses fading into the distance. Akharekhan stood amid the devastation, his skeletal form still and imposing, but the glow of his armor was dimmer, and the fire in his eyes flickered faintly. The sandstorm had drained much of his magic, leaving him weakened. Akharekhan approached cautiously, his tone carefully neutral. "My lord, the storm was magnificent. But such power comes at a cost." Akharekhan turned his gaze on the necromancer, his voice sharp. "Do not presume to lecture me, worm. The cost is mine to bear." Akharekhan bowed deeply, his unease barely hidden. "Of course, my king. I only mean to serve." The Tomb King ignored him, his focus shifting to the horizon. The gray mountains were closer now, their peaks cutting jagged silhouettes against the sky. The dwarves had failed to stop him, but the battle had taken its toll. Akharekhan knew his enemies would not relent, and the next battle would come soon. For now, though the path remained clear, the leyline nexus awaited. Chapter 15. The Noble's Reckoning. The hidden manor of Baron Dietrich von Carlson sat deep within the woods, shrouded by thick trees and an unnatural quiet. Once a proud estate, it now bore the scars of its master's paranoia. Windows were boarded up, the gates locked tight, and guards patrolled nervously, their faces pale from weeks of isolation and fear. Inside, von Carlson paced the grand hall, his finely tailored clothes disheveled and his face gaunt. The weight of his decisions hung over him like a curse, the horrors he had unleashed trailing him even into his dreams. He clutched a goblet of wine in one trembling hand, his other twitching toward a dagger at his side. "You'll be safe here," he muttered to himself, his voice thin and cracked. "Safe, as long as they don't find you." Outside, Marcus Vola crouched among the trees, his dark coat blending with the shadows. Beside him, Magnus Craig studied the manor through a spyglass, his eccentric demeanor replaced with grim focus. "Are you sure he's here?" Voller asked, his voice low. Magnus adjusted his spectacles and nodded. "The Baron fled with a satchel of documents from the tomb's excavation. I've pieced together the locations he might consider safe, and this manor fits his movements. I'd stake my life he's hiding within those walls." Fuller's gloved hand rested on the hilt of his silvered sword. "If he's here, we'll get what we need. The Baron's greed has brought this nightmare upon us, and I'll see him answer for it." Magnus shifted uncomfortably. Just Don't kill him before we've learned what he knows." The witch hunter smirked faintly. "I'll try to contain myself." The infiltration was swift and precise. Valor and Magnus skirted the edges of the manor, using the shadows to evade the nervous guards. With a deft motion, Valor dispatched a sentry near the back door, his pistol silencer muting the shot. Magnus winced at the sight, but followed closely, clutching his tome as if it might shield him from harm. Inside, the grand hall was dimly lit, its once ornate decor tarnished by neglect. The air smelled of stale wine and unwashed bodies, a testament to the Baron's decline. Voller gestured for silence, his movements deliberate as they crept toward the sound of pacing footsteps. They found von Carlson in his study, muttering to himself as he pored over faded documents spread across a cluttered desk. He jumped as the door slammed open, spinning to face the intruders with wide, terrified eyes. "You!" he gasped, his hand fumbling for the dagger at his belt. "Stay back. I have guards." "Your guards are unconscious," Voller interrupted coldly, stepping into the room with his sword drawn. "And you, Baron, have nowhere to run." Von Carlson backed against the wall, his dagger shaking in his hand. "You don't understand. It wasn't my fault. I didn't know what would happen." Magnus stepped forward, his tone uncharacteristically sharp. "You desecrated an ancient tomb, stole its treasures, and unleashed a king of undeath upon the Empire. If that wasn't your fault, Baron, whose was it?" Von Carlson's knees buckled, and he collapsed into a chair, clutching his head. "I didn't know. The texts, the scholars, they said nothing about a curse. I wanted to leave my mark, to be remembered." Valor leaned closer, his blade glinting in the faint light. "And now you'll be remembered as the man who brought ruin to the Empire. Akharekhan marches on the Grey Mountains, and his power grows with every step. You're going to tell us everything about the tomb, the artifacts, and that cursed seal you stole." Von Carlson paled further. "The Pharaoh's seal, I only have a fragment, I swear. The rest was broken when we opened the sarcophagus." Magnus interjected, his voice sharp. "The fragment you kept, it's bound to Akharekhan, isn't it? That's why he's grown so powerful." The Baron nodded, sweat beading on his brow. "Yes, the seal was meant to anchor his spirit, to bind him to the tomb for eternity. Without it, his power is unrestrained, and the fragment, it calls to him. He'll stop at nothing to reclaim it." Voller's expression darkened. "And where is the fragment now?" Von Carlson hesitated, his eyes darting to the desk. Before he could move, Voller slammed his hand onto the desk, scattering papers and revealing a small, ornate box. The witch hunter flipped it open, revealing the golden shard of the Pharaoh's seal. The artifact pulsed faintly, its glow dim but unmistakable. "You kept it here," Magnus said, incredulous. "Do you have any idea how dangerous this is?" Von Carlson stammered, his voice weak. I thought it was safe. The wards." "Once won't stop Akharekhan," Voller snapped, closing the box and tucking it into his coat. "We'll take this to Selina. Perhaps her magic can weaken its hold on him." The Baron grabbed Voller's sleeve, desperation in his eyes. "You can't leave me here. He'll come for me." Voller yanked his arm free, his voice like ice. "You deserve no better, but if you value your miserable life, run far and fast. Pray he doesn't find you." Von Carlson crumpled to the floor as the witch hunter and scholar left the room, his sobs echoing in the empty halls. The fragment was secure, but Voller knew it was only a matter of time before Akharekhan's wrath descended upon them. The clock was ticking, and the fate of the Empire hung in the balance. Chapter 16. The Mountain Ascent. The Grey Mountains rose like jagged teeth, their snow-capped peaks cutting into the sky. The path ahead was narrow and treacherous, winding through rocky outcrops and shadowed valleys. Akharekhan stood at the forefront of his skeletal host, his burning green eyes fixed on the peaks above. The cold, thin air would have sapped the strength of living men, but his undead legions marched in silence, unfazed by the elements. Though his forces had been diminished by battles with the Empire and the dwarves, Akharekhan's determination was undimmed. Each step brought him closer to the leyline nexus, where his ritual would open a portal back to Nehekhara and restore his kingdom's glory. Behind him, Akharekhan rode on his skeletal steed, his nervous gaze flitting to the shadowed cliffs above. "The mountains are no place for the living," Akharekhan muttered, breaking the silence. "And not all who dwell here are dead." Akharekhan did not turn. "Speak plainly, worm." Akharekhan hesitated. "The beastmen, my lord. These mountains are riddled with their tribes, savage brutes who despise all intruders, living or otherwise." The Tomb King's scornful chuckle was dry and hollow. "Beastsmen are no threat to me. If they dare stand in my path, they will serve my will as all others do." The ambush came at dusk, as the undead army made its way through a narrow gorge. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the jagged cliffs. A low guttural horn sounded, its mournful call echoing through the valley. Moments later, the beastmen emerged from the darkness. They charged from the cliffs above and the rocky outcrops to the sides of the pass, their twisted forms lithe and brutish. Clad in crude armor fashioned from bone and hide, the beastmen howled as they descended upon the undead. Their axes, clubs, and spears glinted faintly in the fading light, and their monstrous faces were twisted with rage. The skeletal warriors held firm, their formation unshaken as the first wave of beastmen crashed into them. Bone met muscle and fur, the sound of splintering skeletons mingling with the roars of the attackers. Though many beastmen fell to the undead's unrelenting blades, their numbers seemed endless, and their ferocity pushed the skeletal ranks back. Akharekhan shouted over the din of battle, his staff crackling with dark energy. "My lord, their numbers!" "Silence," Akharekhan commanded, his voice resonating with authority. The Tomb King strode forward, his scimitar of eternal sands blazing with unholy light. With a single swing, he cleaved through a charging beastman, his blade cutting through flesh and bone as though they were air. Another beastman lunged at him with a jagged spear, but Akharekhan deflected the blow with his staff before striking the creature down. The beastman's second wave emerged, larger and more organized, led by a massive beast lord wielding a rusted axe almost as tall as a man. The creature bellowed a guttural challenge, its yellow eyes locking on to Akharekhan. "You defile the wilds," the beast lord roared in its twisted tongue. "You are unworthy of the bloodletting. Die, intruder." Akharekhan raised his staff, his tone imperious. "You are vermin, unfit to speak before a king. Your blood will serve my purpose." As the beast lord charged, Akharekhan unleashed a wave of necromantic energy that rippled outward from his staff. The force blasted the lesser beastmen off their feet, leaving them writhing in agony as their lifeblood was drained from their bodies. The ground beneath them blackened, and their corpses twitched unnaturally as they began to rise. The beast lord swung its axe in a wide arc, aiming to cleave Akharekhan in two. The Tomb King stepped aside with inhuman grace, countering with a precise strike of his scimitar that severed the beast lord's arm. The monstrous creature roared in pain but fought on, its strength unmatched by any mortal foe. Akharekhan ended the duel with a thrust of his blade, driving it through the beast lord's chest. The creature's roar faded into a choking gurgle as its body collapsed, its life snuffed out by the power of the scimitar of eternal sands. With a flick of his staff, Akharekhan raised the beast lord's corpse as a new abomination, a towering skeleton that glowed with faint green fire, its once mighty frame now a weapon of undeath. The remaining beastmen faltered as they saw their leader fall. Akharekhan's risen dead turned on their former kin, tearing through the ranks of the living with savage efficiency. The battle ended in moments, the beastmen crushed, and their bodies added to the Tomb King's growing army. As the last echoes of battle faded, Akharekhan approached cautiously, his expression a mix of awe and fear. "You were right, my lord. The beastmen were no match for you." Akharekhan did not respond immediately. He stood atop the beast lord's ruined corpse, his staff planted firmly in the ground. The fragment of the pharaoh's seal embedded in his armor glowed faintly, its power replenishing the magic he had expended. "This is the fate of all who stand against me," Akharekhan said finally, his voice heavy with disdain. "These beasts, like the mortals who crawl upon this land, are unworthy of their existence. They will serve me in death as they should have in life." Kael'rik bowed deeply. "What are your orders, great king?" Akharekhan turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the peaks of the gray mountains towered in the distance. "We press on. The nexus awaits, and my victory is inevitable." The undead army resumed its march, their ranks bolstered by the corpses of the beastmen. The ground they left behind was scarred and lifeless, a testament to the power of the Tomb King. Nothing would stop Akharekhan from reaching the ley line and reclaiming the glory of Nehekhara. Chapter 17. The Coalition Reforms. The early morning light bathed the fortified town of Yurstreich, glinting off the steel of freshly polished armor and the banners of the twin-tailed comet fluttering in the wind. The atmosphere within the town was charged with anticipation as warriors, priests, and battle-hardened dwarves gathered in the town square. For weeks the coalition had weathered setbacks and defeat, but today marked the beginning of a renewed effort, a final stand against the tide of undeath. Marcus Voller, the witch hunter, stood atop a makeshift platform, his coat and wide-brimmed hat stark against the pale sky. Beside him were his closest allies, Magnus Craig, the eccentric scholar whose knowledge of Nehekhara had guided them thus far, Selena Emberlight, the bright wizard whose fiery magic had turned the tide in previous battles, and Thrain, Ironbeard, the grizzled dwarf war leader who had narrowly escaped death in the Grey Mountains. Together they prepared to address the growing assembly. The coalition's numbers had swelled overnight. Reinforcements from surrounding towns and holds had answered the call to arms, bringing fresh strength to the battered forces. Dwarves clad in glittering mail stood shoulder to shoulder with human soldiers, their axes and hammers gleaming in the light. Militia fighters from the nearby provinces mingled with seasoned Reikland soldiers, their weapons newly forged or repaired after skirmishes with Akharekhan's forces. At the center of the gathering, a Sigmarite priest stood tall, his bald head shining with ceremonial oils. Father Alaric, a man of unyielding faith and booming voice, clutched a golden warhammer engraved with holy runes. His arrival had brought a sense of hope to the coalition, his sermons rallying the weary and bolstering their resolve. "Sigmar's light shines brightest in the darkness," Alaric declared, his voice carrying across the square. "This is our moment, brothers and sisters. The undead king seeks to defile our land, but he shall find no quarter here. With the strength of Sigmar and the courage of the faithful, we will drive this abomination back to the grave." The crowd erupted in cheers, their spirits lifted by the priest's fervor. Voller stepped forward, raising his hand for silence. "We have suffered greatly," Voller began, his voice firm but grim. "Villages have burned, men and women have fallen, families have been torn apart by this plague of undeath, but we have not broken." He gestured to the gathered forces. "Look around you. Sigmar's faithful, the noble sons and daughters of the Empire, and our stalwart dwarven allies. Together, we are stronger than the sum of our parts. We have one purpose, one mission, to stop Akharekhan before he reaches the nexus in the Grey Mountains." Baller's gaze swept over the crowd. "Make no mistake, this will be a battle unlike any other. Akharekhan wields powers we can scarcely comprehend, but he is not invincible. We have knowledge, strategy, and the will to endure. And with your strength we will stand." After the speech, the coalition began its preparations in earnest. The dwarves, led by Thrain Ironbeard, worked tirelessly to reinforce the town's defenses and prepare siege-baking weapons for the coming battles. Massive bolt throwers and organ guns were mounted on wagons, their runes glowing faintly as engineers checked their mechanisms. Thrain, still recovering from his wounds, barked orders to his kin with characteristic vigor. "Load those barrels faster. If that undead king so much as looks at us, we'll give him a proper dwarven welcome." The humans worked alongside the dwarves, forging pikes and reinforcing their armor. Magnus Krieg moved among them, sharing his knowledge of Akharekhan's tactics and warning of the challenges they would face. He carried with him the fragment of the pharaoh's seal, its faint glow attracting wary glances from the soldiers. Selena Emberlight took charge of the magical preparations. Alongside a group of Empire battle wizards, she devised wards and barriers to counteract Akharekhan's necromantic magic. Her fiery presence inspired confidence among the troops, though the weight of the coming battle was evident in her furrowed brow. "We can't hope to match his power outright," Selena told the wizards as they worked. "But if we focus our energy on disrupting his spells and protecting the living, we can turn the tide. Remember, fire consumes all, even the undead." As night fell, the coalition gathered for one final blessing. Father Alaric stood at the center of the square, raising his warhammer high as he invoked Sigmar's name. A faint, golden light enveloped the crowd, filling them with warmth and resolve. "Sigmar watches over you," Alaric proclaimed. "He is with you in every swing of your blade, every step you take into the darkness. Stand tall, and let the undead tremble before the might of the living." The soldiers and dwarfs cheered, their spirits renewed. Voller exchanged a glance with Magnus, the two men sharing a silent moment of understanding. The odds were steep, but the coalition was ready. The next morning, the army began its march toward the Grey Mountains, their banners fluttering in the cold wind. At the head of the column, Voller led with determination, his silvered sword gleaming at his side. Behind him, the forces of the Empire and the dwarves moved as one, their steps synchronized with purpose. Far above them, on the distant peaks of the mountains, a faint green glow flickered, a harbinger of the battle to come. Akharekhan awaited, his forces growing stronger with each passing hour. But the coalition was no longer fragmented, no longer hesitant. Together they would face the undead king and fight for the survival of the empire. The time for vengeance had come. Chapter 18. The Lost Memories. The icy winds of the Grey Mountains howled through the narrow pass, carrying with them the whispers of a forgotten age. Akharekhan stood atop a craggy outcrop, his skeletal form outlined against the pale moonlight. The fragment of the pharaoh's seal embedded in his chest pulsed faintly, its golden glow casting eerie shadows on the barren rock. His undead army stood motionless behind him, their empty sockets glowing faintly as they awaited his command. But Akharekhan's attention was elsewhere, his gaze distant as the cold wind seemed to stir something deep within his ancient soul. The memories came like fractured glass, jagged pieces of a life long past forcing themselves to the surface. In his mind's eye, Akharekhan saw the golden sands of Nehekhara stretching endlessly beneath a burning sun. The air was filled with the sound of chanting priests and the rhythmic pounding of drums. He stood atop a grand ziggurat, its steps lined with kneeling subjects who chanted his name. He remembered the weight of the crown upon his brow, the cool, polished surface of the scimitar of eternal sands in his hand. He was Akharekhan the Glorious, ruler of the Golden Kingdom, a king whose ambition and power had been unmatched. Yet beneath the grandeur there was unease, a shadow that tainted even his most triumphant moments. The vision shifted, and Akharekhan found himself in the dimly lit halls of his palace. The air was thick with incense, and the walls were adorned with intricate carvings depicting his victories. Before him knelt a man, his trusted general, Awoke, his head bowed in feigned submission. "My king," Awoke said, his voice laced with false humility, "your reign is eternal, and your enemies tremble at your name." But even then Akharekhan had sensed the deceit. Anuket's loyalty had always been conditional, his ambitions veiled behind a mask of devotion. In the weeks that followed, the betrayal unfolded. Anuket, in league with rival kings, orchestrated a coup. The grand palace was overrun, the sacred tombs desecrated, and the loyal servants of Akharekhan butchered. In the end, it was not a sword that felled Akharekhan, but treachery. He was bound and cast into his own sarcophagus, the pharaoh's seal placed upon him to anchor his soul to the tomb. The rival kings, fearful of his vengeance even in death, performed rites to ensure he would never rise again. The last thing he remembered before the darkness consumed him was Anuket's smirk and the words that seared into his mind. "Your ambition was your undoing, Akharekhan. Sleep now, and let the sands reclaim your name." The fragmented memories burned in his mind, and Akharekhan's green-lit eyes flared brighter as rage coursed through him. His skeletal hand tightened around the staff of the black sun, its scarab head glowing in response to his fury. "Anuket," he hissed, the name a curse spat into the cold night air. "You thought you could erase me, bury me beneath the sands, strike my name from history." His voice grew louder, resonating through the pass. "But I am eternal. My wrath will not be contained. My glory will not be forgotten. You may be dust now, but your treachery has lit a fire that will consume all who stand in my way." The fragment of the pharaoh's seal pulsed again, drawing his thoughts to the present. This was not Nehekhara. The land around him was crude and foreign, its mountains and forests a stark contrast to the golden deserts he had once ruled. The empire's mortals were barbaric and unworthy of the life they clung to. Yet in their resistance they reminded him of Anuket, fools defying the inevitable. Akharekhan's burning eyes turned toward the horizon where the leyline nexus awaited. He had nearly reached the place where his full power would be restored. From there he would open a portal to Nehekhara and summon the might of his kingdom to reclaim his throne. But as the memories faded, a deeper longing stirred within him, a yearning for the sunlit sands, the sound of priests chanting his name, the feeling of ruling a people who had once revered him as a living god. The rage that had fueled him since his awakening now carried an edge of sorrow. His kingdom, his people, his glory, they were gone, reduced to dust by the passage of time. All that remained was vengeance, a cold purpose that drove him forward like an unrelenting tide. Akharekhan approached cautiously, his skeletal steed clattering on the rocky ground. "My lord," the necromancer said hesitantly, "your forces are ready to march. The nexus is within reach." Akharekhan did not respond immediately. He stood motionless, his staff planted firmly in the ground, as though listening to something only he could hear. At last he spoke, his voice low and heavy with ancient grief. "This land disgusts me, Akharekhan. Its people are weak, its gods pale shadows of what once was. They will never understand the glory of Nehekhara." Akharekhan bowed his head, unsure of how to respond. "They are nothing compared to your greatness, my king. Their resistance is futile." Akharekhan turned, the fire in his eyes burning brighter. "It is, but they will suffer for their defiance. Their blood will pave the way for my return." He raised his staff, and the skeletal army began to move, their ranks filling the narrow pass as they advanced toward the leyline nexus. Behind them, the corrupted ground bore the scars of their passage, a wasteland where no life could flourish. Akharekhan's memories faded into the recesses of his mind, but their weight lingered. His longing for Nehekhara, his rage at the betrayal that had stolen it from him, and his hatred for this new, unworthy world all coalesced into a singular purpose. Nothing would stop him. Not the empire, not the dwarves, not even the gods themselves. He was Akharekhan, and his name would be remembered for all eternity. Chapter 19. The Siege of Karak Tor. The ancient dwarven hold of Karak-Tor stood defiant in the heart of the Grey Mountains, its gates carved from unyielding stone and its walls etched with runes of protection. Built millennia ago to withstand sieges from orcs, Skaven, and even the fiery wrath of dragons, Karak-Tor was more than just a fortress. It was a sacred repository of the dwarves' history, their ancestral halls descending deep into the earth where veins of precious minerals pulsed with geomantic power. The dwarves of Karak-Tor knew war was coming. Scouts had brought grim tidings of Akharekhan's approach, and the undead king's corruption had already begun to creep across the lower slopes of the mountain. The hold was fortified, its gates sealed, and its warriors ready. But even the stubborn resilience of the dwarves would be tested against the unrelenting will of a tomb king. The assault began at dawn, though the sunlight was muted by the thick, unnatural mist that preceded Akharekhan's forces. The skeletal legions advanced in perfect silence, their ranks filling the valley below the hold's mighty gates. Hulking bone constructs, their forms twisted and grotesque, loomed over the skeletal infantry, their heavy footfalls sending tremors through the earth. At the forefront stood Akharekhan, his burning eyes fixed on the dwarven hold. He raised his staff high, and his voice boomed across the battlefield like the grinding of ancient stone. "Dwarfs of Karak-Tor, your halls are an affront to the glory of Nehekhara. Your treasures will be mine and your names forgotten. Open your gates and submit, or be crushed beneath the sands of eternity." From the ramparts, Thane Gorgrin Ironbeard answered, his voice a thunderous roar. "You'll find no cowardice here, Bone King. We'll see you and your cursed army ground to dust. Come, if you've the spine for it." Akharek's reply was a gesture of his staff. The undead surged forward, their march eerily silent, save for the clatter of bones and rusted metal. The siege had begun. The dwarves unleashed their fury. Cannon fire echoed through the mountains, iron balls tearing through the ranks of skeletal warriors and scattering their remains. Grudge throwers hurled explosive charges into the enemy lines, sending bone fragments raining down in fiery showers. Crossbow bolts rained from the walls, striking constructs and piercing through ranks of undead. For a time, the undead advance seemed to falter. The dwarves cheered as their weapons wreaked havoc on Akharekhan's forces. But the Tomb King stood undeterred, his staff raised as he chanted in the guttural tongue of Nehekhara. Green energy rippled outward, and the shattered remains of the fallen began to stir. Broken bones knit together, and the undead rose once more, their ranks replenished as quickly as they were destroyed. "Go long," Horgrin bellowed, his axe raised high. "They'll not take these gates while a single dwarf draws breath." Akharekhan stepped forward, the fragment of the pharaoh's seal embedded in his armor glowing brightly. His scimitar shimmered with an unnatural heat, and with a single slash he unleashed a wave of energy that struck the gates of Karak-Tor. The runes on the gates flared in defiance, holding against the assault, but cracks began to form along their edges. "Your wards are strong," Akharekhan said, his voice resonating with disdain, "but they cannot stand against the power of Nehekhara." He raised his staff again, chanting a spell of immense power. The earth beneath the undead army began to tremble, and a massive construct of bone and stone emerged from the ground. The creature towered over the battlefield, its skeletal frame bound together by glowing veins of magic. With a deafening roar, the construct lumbered toward the gates shuddered with each impact, and the dwarves redoubled their efforts. Cannons targeted the construct, their fire ripping through its limbs, but the creature's sheer size and magical reinforcement allowed it to endure. Under its relentless assault, the gates began to buckle. Inside the hold, the battle took on a desperate tone. As the gates gave way, the undead poured into the lower halls, meeting fierce resistance from the dwarves. Iron breakers held the line, their shields locked as they clashed with skeletal warriors in brutal melee combat. Rune lords chanted ancient prayers, their runic magic lashing out at the undead and warding the dwarves from Akharekhan's corruption. Akharekhan strode through the chaos, his scimitar cutting down any who dared challenge him. He ignored the dwarven defenses, his gaze fixed on the deeper halls where the geomantic power of the hold was strongest. The energy called to him, a pulse of life that he intended to corrupt and claim. Thane Gorgron charged at the Tomb King, his rune axe glowing brightly. "You'll not take our ancestors' halls, you cursed relic!" he roared, swinging his weapon in a powerful arc. Akharekhan parried with ease, the scimitar of eternal sands deflecting the blow. "You cannot stop the inevitable, dwarf," he intoned, countering with a strike that forced Gorgron to his knees. But before Akharekhan could deliver a killing blow, a massive tremor shook the halls. The dwarves, in a desperate act of defiance, had detonated their own stores of black powder, collapsing parts of the hold to cut off the undead advance. The walls cracked, and massive stone pillars toppled, burying both the living and the dead. In the aftermath, Karaktor lay in ruins. Much of the hold had collapsed, its lower halls sealed off beneath tons of rubble. The dwarves who survived retreated to the upper levels, their numbers decimated, but their spirits unbroken. Akharekhan stood in the shattered remnants of the geomantic chamber, the pulsing energy of the ley line flowing through him. The fragment of the pharaoh's seal glowed brighter than ever, its power magnified by the stolen magic of the dwarven hold. Though his forces had suffered heavy losses, the Tomb King's purpose had been fulfilled. He turned and marched from the ruined hold, his skeletal warriors reforming around him. The path to the ley line nexus was clear, and Akharekhan's power had reached new heights. As the corrupted remains of Karaktor faded into the distance, the Tomb King's burning eyes fixed on the horizon. The time of reckoning drew near. Chapter 20. The Mage's Gambit. The coalition army camped in the shadow of the Grey Mountains, their banners fluttering in the cold wind. Fires dotted the hillside, their light revealing tired faces and weary soldiers sharpening their weapons for the battle they all knew was coming. Among them, Selena Emberlight, the bright wizard, sat apart, her crimson robes reflecting the glow of her staff, which pulsed faintly with the fire magic she had spent hours channeling. But tonight, Selena's fiery confidence was dimmed. She had been poring over a Nehekhara grimoire provided by Magnus Craig, the scholar who had unearthed so much about Akharekhan. The text was ancient and foreboding, its pages crackling with forbidden knowledge. "Are you certain about this?" Magnus asked nervously, standing beside her. His hands fidgeted with the edges of his notes, his usually eccentric demeanor replaced with somber hesitation. "No," Selena admitted, her eyes fixed on the glowing glyphs in the book. "But we've run out of time. Akharekhan is too strong. If we wait until he reaches the ley line nexus, it's over." Magnus adjusted his spectacles. "Forbidden magic always carries a cost. The Bright Order won't forgive you if—" Selena cut him off, her voice firm. "If we fail, there won't be an order left to condemn me. This magic might delay him long enough for the coalition to regroup." She rose, gripping her staff tightly. The firelight danced in her amber eyes, but there was a shadow there, a flicker of doubt that even she couldn't suppress. "I know the risks, Magnus, but this is our only chance." At dawn, the coalition moved to intercept Akharekhan. The undead king's forces marched steadily up the mountain path, their skeletal forms shrouded in a faint mist of sand and decay. Akharekhan himself strode at the center, the fragment of the pharaoh's seal glowing with newfound power after the fall of Karaktor. The coalition forces formed a defensive line on a ridge overlooking the path. Marcus Voller, the witch hunter, stood at its head, his silvered sword gleaming in the pale light. Dwarven artillery teams prepared their cannons, their weapons aimed at the approaching horde. Selena stood behind them, her staff glowing as she prepared to unleash her spell. When the undead army entered range, the coalition struck. Cannon fire roared, and volleys of crossbow bolts rained down on the skeletal legions. For a moment the line held, the relentless barrage forcing the undead to halt. But Akharekhan raised his staff, and with a single word of power, the fallen warriors rose again, their shattered forms reassembling with unnerving precision. "This is it," Selena murmured, stepping forward. The bright wizard raised her staff high, her voice rising as she chanted the incantation from the forbidden text. The wind picked up, swirling around her in a vortex of flame and ash. Glyphs from the grimoire appeared in the air, burning brightly as the spell took shape. A massive firestorm erupted from her staff, descending upon Akharekhan's forces like a vengeful comet. The flames consumed the undead, turning bone and metal to ash. Even the sandstorm that accompanied Akharekhan faltered, its unholy magic disrupted by the sheer power of Selena's spell. The coalition forces cheered as the undead lines crumbled. But Selena wasn't finished. Her voice grew louder, the spell expanding as she attempted to seal the pass itself. The ground began to crack and heave, rocks tumbling down to block the path. Akharekhan stopped, raising his staff as he felt the surge of magic. The spell was powerful, but the Tomb King recognized the incantation woven into its core. It was a bastardization of Nehekhara's ancient rites, a crude attempt to harness the very magic he had mastered in life. "Foolish mortal," Akharekhan intoned, his voice resonating over the battlefield. "You meddle with forces you cannot comprehend." With a gesture, he drove his staff into the ground. The fragment of the pharaoh's seal embedded in his armor flared with golden light, and the air around him shimmered with heat. The remnants of the firestorm parted as Akharekhan chanted in the guttural tongue of Nehekhara. The same glyphs that Selena had conjured now appeared around him, glowing brighter and more vivid as he bent the magic to his will. Selena faltered as she felt the spell slipping from her control. No, this can't be." Akharekhan extended his hand, and the stolen magic twisted, reshaping itself into a massive wave of sand and flame. The torrent surged forward, engulfing the coalition's front lines. Soldiers and dwarves screamed as the sandstorm scoured flesh and metal alike, their formations crumbling under the onslaught. Magnus rushed to Selena's side, shouting over the roar of the storm. "You have to stop it! He's using your spell against us!" "I can't," Selena cried, her voice laced with panic. "He's too strong." As the sandstorm subsided, Akharekhan strode forward, his skeletal form wreathed in the remnants of the spell's energy. The coalition forces, battered and broken, scrambled to regroup. Vola rallied the survivors, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Fall back," he ordered. "We can't stop him here." Selena, drained and trembling, collapsed to her knees. Magnus pulled her to her feet, his expression grim. "Come on, you've done enough." She looked at him, her eyes hollow. "I've made it worse." The coalition retreated, their forces in disarray. Akharekhan did not pursue. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the leyline nexus, the power he had tapped from the stolen spell surging through him. The failure of the coalition's gambit had not only failed to delay him, it had strengthened his connection to the ancient rituals of Nehekhara. The Tomb King raised his staff, the fragment of the pharaoh's seal glowing like a miniature sun. "The mortal's defiance is pitiful," he said, his voice echoing through the mountains. "Their magic is but a pale shadow of my own." His army reformed, their ranks bolstered by the corpses left behind by the coalition's failed assault. The leyline nexus was close now, its energy calling to him like a beacon. The final confrontation was at hand. Chapter 21. The Portal Ritual. The leyline nexus lay in a secluded valley deep within the Grey Mountains, a place where the Earth's geomantic energy surged like a river, unseen but undeniably powerful. Ancient standing stones, weathered and cracked, marked the site, their surfaces carved with runes and glyphs from long-forgotten civilizations. The air hummed with latent power, a constant thrumming that resonated deep in the bones. Akharekhan stood at the center of the nexus, his towering skeletal frame radiating a palpable aura of dominance. The fragment of the pharaoh's seal embedded in his armor pulsed like a heartbeat, its golden light synchronized with the rhythm of the ley line's energy. Around him, his undead army stood motionless, forming a vast ring. "This is the place," Akharekhan said, his voice low and resonant, as though speaking to the stones themselves. "The earth's power flows through these veins, and its strength will serve my purpose." Awoke, the necromancer, approached cautiously, his gaze darting nervously between the Tomb King and the glowing ley line stones. "My lord," he said, his voice trembling, "the ritual you're about to perform, it is beyond anything I have seen. Even the mightiest mortal spellcasters would balk at such power." Akharekhan turned his burning eyes on the necromancer, his tone sharp. "That is because mortals are weak. Their understanding of magic a pale shadow of the truth. Watch closely, worm, and see what true power looks like." With a sweeping motion, Akharekhan drove the staff of the black sun into the ground. A wave of green energy rippled outward, igniting the glyphs on the standing stones. The air grew heavy, and the ground beneath the nexus began to blacken and crack, as though life itself was recoiling from the ritual. The Tomb King raised his arms, chanting in the guttural tongue of Nehekhara. His voice resonated with the weight of ages, and as he spoke, the glowing glyphs on the stones pulsed brighter, casting an eerie light across the valley. The fragment of the pharaoh's seal flared, its power merging with the ley line's energy and sending a column of golden light shooting into the sky. The earth trembled violently, and the skies above darkened as storm clouds gathered unnaturally fast. Lightning crackled across the heavens, illuminating the mountains in brief, blinding flashes. The land around the nexus began to wither, grass turning to ash and trees collapsing into brittle husks. Rivers dried into cracked riverbeds, their life-giving water consumed by the ritual's hunger. Awoke watched in awe and terror as the ritual unfolded. "He's draining the land itself," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "The ley line, it's feeding him." Akharekhan's voice grew louder, the chants rising to a crescendo. The column of light expanded, and within its golden core, swirling patterns began to form. A shimmering portal took shape, its edges crackling with green fire. Through the portal, the faint image of endless sands and towering pyramids became visible. The desert expanse of Nehekhara, distorted as though viewed through water. The Tomb King's green-lit eyes flared brighter at the sight of his homeland. For a moment he stood still, his skeletal form radiating triumph. "Nehekhara," he said, his voice filled with reverence. "Your king returns." But the portal was not yet stable. The energy required to maintain it strained the ley line, the stones glowing so brightly they threatened to shatter. Akharekhan raised his staff again, channeling his power to stabilize the rift. Each word of his chant seemed to deepen the corruption of the land, the circle of desolation spreading outward like a plague. Miles away, the coalition forces stood on a high ridge overlooking the valley. Marcus Voller lowered his spyglass, his face grim. "He's begun," the witch hunter said. "The land is dying, and that portal, it's nearly complete." Selina Emberlight, her robe still singed from the failed gambit, clenched her staff tightly. "If he stabilizes that portal, it's over. His army will flood through, and the Empire will fall." Thrain Ironbeard, his axe resting on his shoulder, spat into the dirt. "We've got one chance, and it won't be a pretty one. We'll have to stop that ritual before he opens the gates." Magnus Craig adjusted his spectacles, his hands trembling slightly. "He's drawing power from the ley line and the pharaoh's seal. If we can sever his connection to either, it might destabilize the portal." Vala nodded. "And that's our objective. Selina, Magnus, you'll focus on disrupting the ley line. Thrain, you'll lead the dwarves to hold off his forces. I'll deal with Akharekhan." Selina hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "And if we fail?" The witch hunter's gaze hardened. "We won't." Back at the Nexus, the portal swirled with growing intensity, its edges solidifying as the ritual neared completion. Akharekhan's voice rang out above the roaring winds, his chants infused with the power of the fragment. The connection to Nehekhara grew stronger, and the faint outlines of skeletal warriors and towering constructs began to appear on the other side. The ground beneath the Nexus cracked open, revealing glowing veins of pure ley-line energy. Akharekhan extended his hand, his skeletal fingers brushing the glowing strands. The energy surged into him, amplifying his power and stabilizing the portal further. The glow of the Pharaoh's seal intensified, its golden light radiating like a miniature sun. But even as the ritual neared its climax, Akharekhan sensed movement in the distance. The coalition forces, battered but determined, were advancing toward the Nexus. His green-lit eyes flared with contempt as he turned his gaze toward the approaching army. "Fools," he intoned, his voice echoing through the valley. "You come to witness the dawn of eternity. Bow before me, and I may yet spare your pitiful lives." The coalition did not slow. Akharekhan raised his staff, the undead army moving to intercept the attackers. The final confrontation had begun, and the fate of the Empire hung in the balance. The portal's energy surged once more, the vision of Nehekhara growing clearer, but the Tomb King knew the mortals would not stop until they were broken. With his power drawn to the ritual, the coming battle would test his will like never before. Chapter 22. The Army of Light. The mountain plateau above the ley-line Nexus trembled under the weight of the impending battle. The corruption emanating from Akharekhan's ritual had twisted the landscape into a blackened wasteland. Jagged fissures split the ground, spewing faint tendrils of green light, and the air crackled with the sound of unstable magic. In the center of the chaos, the swirling portal to Nehekhara loomed, growing brighter and more stable with each passing moment. On the ridge overlooking the plateau, the coalition forces gathered for one final stand. The once disparate factions of dwarves, empire soldiers, Sigmarite priests, and mages stood united under hastily stitched banners bearing the twin-tailed comet. Their faces were grim, but their eyes burned with resolve. They had seen the devastation left in Akharekhan's wake, and they knew this was their last chance to stop him. At the head of the army, Marcus Valor addressed the gathered warriors. His voice carried over the din of preparation, each word cutting through the tension like steel. "This is it," he said, his silvered sword gleaming in the pale light. "Akharekhan seeks to bring his ancient empire back from the sands of time. But we will not let him. This is our land, our home, and we will fight for it with everything we have." He turned to Father Elric, the Sigmarite priest who stepped forward and raised his golden warhammer. His voice boomed with divine authority as he invoked the blessings of Sigmar. "Brothers and sisters, do not fear the darkness. Sigmar's light burns within us, and it shall guide us to victory. Stand tall, for the God-King watches over you." A cheer rose from the ranks, shaky but growing in strength. Selena Emberlight, her staff crackling with fiery energy, exchanged a glance with Magnus Craig, who clutched his tome of Nehekhara lore. "Are we ready for this?" she asked quietly. "No," Magnus admitted. "But we don't have a choice." The battle began with a deafening roar. The coalition forces charged down the slope, their cries echoing across the plateau. Dwarven cannons unleashed a thunderous barrage, their iron balls tearing through the ranks of Akharekhan's skeletal warriors. Bright wizard fireballs arced through the air, detonating with bursts of flame that lit up the darkened sky. Akharekhan's undead legions responded in kind. Towering bone constructs lumbered forward, their massive frames shrugging off cannon fire as they swung their bone-forged weapons into the coalition lines. Skeletal archers unleashed volleys of arrows, their unerring aim sowing chaos among the advancing soldiers. Amid the fray, Akharekhan stood motionless at the center of the Nexus, his staff planted firmly in the corrupted ground. He chanted steadily, his voice resonating with the power of the ley line. The swirling portal behind him grew brighter, the golden sands of Nehekhara becoming clearer with each passing moment. Despite the chaos around him, he did not falter. Marcus Voller led a vanguard of elite soldiers and dwarven ironbreakers, carving a path through the undead toward the Nexus. His silvered sword flashed in the dim light, cutting down skeletal warriors with each swing. At his side, Thrain Ironbeard roared as he cleaved through the undead with his rune-etched axe. "Keep moving," Volla shouted over the din of battle. "We have to reach Akharekhan before he completes the ritual." Behind them, Selena Emberlight unleashed torrents of fire, the blazing infernos consuming entire ranks of undead. Father Alaric advanced with the militia, his warhammer glowing with holy light as he smashed through skeletal constructs. The priest's prayers rang out over the battlefield, emboldening the living and weakening the undead. But for every undead warrior that fell, 2 more seemed to rise. Akharekhan's necromantic magic flowed unchecked, reanimating the fallen and replenishing his ranks. The coalition forces began to falter under the relentless tide, their line threatening to break. Seeing the danger, Magnus Craig stepped forward, clutching the fragment of the Pharaoh's seal that the coalition had recovered. He raised the artifact high, its golden glow flaring brightly as he recited an incantation from his tome. The fragment pulsed, and a wave of energy rippled outward, disrupting the magic that bound the undead. For a moment, the skeletal warriors faltered, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated. "Now!" Magnus shouted, his voice cracking. "Push forward!" The coalition surged ahead, exploiting the opening created by Magnus's gambit. Voller and Thrain led the charge, cutting their way toward the Nexus with renewed determination. Selena and the other mages channeled their magic into focused blasts, targeting the towering constructs that blocked the path. Akharekhan turned his burning gaze toward the approaching coalition. His voice rose in a commanding chant, and the fragment of the Pharaoh's seal embedded in his armor flared brighter. The portal surged, its edges stabilizing as the shimmering image of Nehekhara grew clearer. The ground beneath the Nexus cracked and heaved, releasing waves of green fire that lashed out at the advancing army. "You dare defy me?" Akharekhan roared, his voice resonating like the grinding of stone. "This land will fall, as all lands must, before the might of Nehekhara. Your gods are weak, your lives fleeting. Bow before your eternal king." The coalition forces braced themselves against the magical onslaught, their resolve unshaken. Voller raised his sword, his voice ringing with defiance. "We bow to no tyrant, living or dead. Sigmar guides us, and we will see you fall." The clash at the Nexus reached a fever pitch. The plateau trembled under the strain of the portal's power, fissures spreading across the ground as the magic of the ley lines spiraled out of control. The coalition's assault pushed closer to Akharekhan, but the undead king's magic was overwhelming, his power bolstered by the fragment and the Nexus. The land itself seemed to rebel against the intrusion, the air filled with the roar of collapsing stone and the cries of the living and dead. As the coalition forces closed in, the final confrontation loomed, an all-or-nothing struggle to stop the ritual and save the empire from an ancient king's unrelenting ambition. Chapter 23. The Necromancer's Betrayal. The swirling chaos of the battlefield raged around the leyline Nexus, the land trembling beneath the weight of Akharekhan's unholy ritual. His undead army clashed with the coalition's forces in a desperate struggle, their skeletal ranks pressing relentlessly forward. Above the fray, the glowing portal to Nehekhara pulsed with a radiant intensity, growing larger and more stable as Akharekhan chanted in the ancient tongue of his homeland. Kaelric, the rogue necromancer, lingered at the edge of the Nexus, his dark robes billowing in the wind stirred by the ritual. His gnarled staff glinted faintly in the light of the portal, but his attention was not on the battle or the collapsing plateau. His eyes were fixed on the fragment of the Pharaoh's seal embedded in Akharekhan's armor. The fragment radiated power, its golden glow entwined with the energy of the ley line. Kael'rik had seen its might firsthand, the way it amplified Akharekhan's magic, the way it bent the ley line's geomantic currents to his will. It was unlike any artifact the necromancer had ever encountered, and the lure of its potential was irresistible. "This is my chance," Kael'rik whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and greed. "With the seal, I could master the secrets of Nehekhara. I could become eternal." Kael'rik's moment came as the coalition pressed closer to the Nexus. Akharekhan's focus remained fixed on the portal, his chance unwavering even as Valor and his forces carved their way through the undead ranks. The rogue necromancer crept forward, his movements hidden by the swirling mist of sand and magic that enveloped the area. As Kael'rik approached, he began muttering a spell under his breath, weaving his own necromantic magic into the fabric of Akharekhan's ritual. It was a dangerous gamble. The Tomb King's magic was ancient and potent, and Kael'rik's tampering could have catastrophic consequences. But the lure of the seal's power outweighed the risk. When he was close enough, Kael'rik thrust his staff forward, aiming a focused pulse of necromantic energy at the fragment of the pharaoh's seal. The magic struck true, severing the fragment's immediate connection to Akharekhan and causing its glow to flicker. The effect was immediate. The portal wavered, its edges destabilizing as the flow of energy from the ley line faltered. Akharekhan's chanting stopped abruptly, and his green-lit eyes flared with fury as he turned to face the source of the disruption. "Tropayeur," Akharekhan hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You dare meddle with my power?" Kael'rik stood his ground, though his trembling hands betrayed his fear. "You've hoarded the secrets of Nehekhara for yourself," he spat, "but no longer. With the seal, I'll master the rites of eternity. I'll become greater than you ever were." Akharek's skeletal form radiated raw power as he raised his staff, the ground cracking beneath him. "Foolish mortal, you cannot comprehend the forces you seek to command. I will show you the price of your arrogance." Akharekhan unleashed a surge of necromantic energy, the force of it shattering Kael'rik's staff and sending the necromancer sprawling. The fragment of the pharaoh's seal glowed brighter, its connection to the ley line partially restored, but the disruption had already taken its toll. The portal flickered erratically, its edges sparking with green fire as the flow of magic became unstable. Kael'rik scrambled to his feet, blood trickling from his mouth. "You're too late, Akharekhan," he gasped, clutching a shard of his broken staff. "The ritual is failing. You won't reach Nehekhara." Akharekhan strode toward the necromancer, his scimitar in hand. "You have doomed yourself and imperiled my kingdom," he said, his voice cold and unyielding. "But your treachery will serve a purpose. Your soul will fuel the portal." With a single, fluid motion, Akharekhan drove his scimitar through Kael'rik's chest. The necromancer's eyes widened in shock as the blade pierced his heart, the glow of the fragment reflected in his fading gaze. Akharekhan raised his staff, and Kael'rik's body disintegrated into ash, his soul consumed by the magic of the portal. "Levod, you've been scaled, Levod, you've been scaled, Levod, please, please, please!" Though Kael'rik was gone, the damage he had inflicted remained. The portal continued to destabilize, its once clear image of Nehekhara now fractured and obscured. The energy of the ley line surged and ebbed unpredictably, and the ground around the Nexus began to collapse into a spiraling void. Akharekhan turned his gaze to the coalition forces who had used the chaos to push closer to the Nexus. Voller, Selena, and Thrain led the charge, their combined efforts carving a path through the remaining undead. The Tomb King raised his staff, his burning eyes narrowing. "You have come far, mortals, but your defiance ends here." Despite the instability of the portal and the fractured ritual, Akharekhan's rage fueled his power. With a sweep of his staff, he summoned a wave of green fire that raced toward the coalition, forcing them to scatter. Valor raised his sword, his voice ringing out over the battlefield. "Press on! He's losing control of the portal. This is our chance." The betrayal of Awoke had disrupted the ritual, but it had also enraged Akharekhan, driving him to unleash his full might. The final confrontation at the Nexus was now inevitable, the fractured portal casting an ominous glow over the crumbling plateau as both sides prepared for the endgame. Chapter 24. The Witch Hunter's Duel. The Nexus was a tempest of chaos, the air thick with swirling sand, green fire, and the acrid stench of burning magic. The fractured portal loomed above the battlefield, its unstable edges sparking violently as the ley line's energy spiraled out of control. The ground beneath it cracked and trembled, threatening to collapse into the abyss. Marcus Voller stood at the edge of the Nexus, his silvered sword gleaming faintly in the corrupted light. Blood seeped from a gash across his brow, and his coat was torn and scorched from the battle, yet his grip on the sword was firm, and his eyes burned with resolve. Before him, Akharekhan stood like a monolith, the fragment of the pharaoh's seal embedded in his chest glowing brighter with each pulse of the unstable portal. "You've come far, mortal," Akharekhan said, his voice deep and resonant, cutting through the chaos. "But your struggle is meaningless. Witness the power of eternity and know despair." Voller took a steadying breath, raising his sword. "Your eternity ends here, Akharekhan. The Empire will not fall to you." The Tomb King tilted his head, his burning green eyes narrowing. Brave words for a doomed man. The duel began with a clash of steel and magic. Akharekhan surged forward, his scimitar of eternal sands cutting through the air in swift, precise arcs. Voller parried with all his strength, the silvered blade of his sword clashing against the scimitar's unholy glow. Sparks flew as their weapons met, the force of each blow sending shockwaves through the unstable ground. Akharekhan moved with the grace of a predator, his skeletal form betraying no weakness. His strikes were deliberate, each one aimed to disarm or incapacitate. Voller countered with calculated precision, his training as a witch hunter allowing him to hold his ground despite the overwhelming power of his foe. "You fight well for a mortal," Akharekhan remarked, deflecting a thrust with his staff. "But your strength will fail. All mortals do." Voller gritted his teeth, stepping back to regain his footing. "If mortals are so weak, why do you fear us enough to build an army of the dead?" Akharekhan's eyes flared, and he lashed out with a wave of green fire. Voller dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the blast as it scorched the ground where he had stood. "Arrogance," the Tomb King growled. "Your defiance is nothing but arrogance." The duel pushed closer to the Nexus as the portal's instability grew. Columns of green energy shot upward, casting grotesque shadows across the battlefield. The ground cracked and heaved beneath their feet, fissures forming with each tremor. Voller saw his opportunity. Amid the chaos, he spotted the source of the ritual's power, the fragment of the pharaoh's seal embedded in Akharekhan's chest. Its golden glow was intertwined with the energy of the portal, a direct conduit to the ley line's magic. Destroying it would unravel the ritual, but doing so would mean facing Akharekhan's full fury. With a shout, Voller charged, his sword aimed for the glowing fragment. Akharekhan raised his staff, summoning a wall of green fire to block the attack. Voller pushed through the flames, the heat searing his coat and flesh as he struck at the Tomb King. The blade pierced Akharekhan's chest, striking the edge of the pharaoh's seal. The fragment flared brightly, its power surging outward in a wave of destructive energy that threw both combatants apart. Voller landed hard, pain radiating through his body as he struggled to rise. Blood seeped from fresh wounds and his vision blurred, but he refused to falter. Across the Nexus, Akharekhan staggered, the glow of the fragment flickering as cracks spread across its surface. "Do you dare?" Akharekhan hissed, his voice filled with rage. He raised his scimitar, striding toward Voller with unrelenting determination. The witch hunter forced himself to his feet, his sword still in hand. He knew he was outmatched, his body battered and his strength fading, but he also knew that this was his moment, his one chance to end the ritual and stop Akharekhan's march of death. As the Tomb King loomed over him, Valor summoned every ounce of his will and lunged. His sword struck the fragment again, this time driving deep into its core. The pharaoh's seal shattered with a deafening crack, releasing a torrent of raw energy that engulfed the nexus. Akharekhan staggered back, his skeletal form writhing as the seal's destruction severed his connection to the ley line. The portal above them flickered violently, its edges collapsing inward as the flow of magic spiraled out of control. "Now," Akharekhan roared, his voice echoing with fury, "you have doomed us all." Valor collapsed to his knees, his vision fading as the energy consumed the battlefield. "Not all," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "The Empire will endure." With a final surge of power, the portal imploded, the golden light collapsing into a singularity before vanishing entirely. The shockwave rippled across the plateau, shattering stone and scattering the undead legions like dust. When the dust settled, the battlefield was eerily silent. The undead army was gone, their forms reduced to ash by the destruction of the portal. The ley line's energy subsided, leaving the nexus scarred but dormant. Amid the rubble, Valor lay motionless, his sword still clutched in his hand. His mortal wounds had claimed him, but his sacrifice had saved the Empire. Far away, the surviving coalition forces looked to the horizon, where the flickering glow of the portal had disappeared. Their cheers rose into the sky, a tribute to the fallen witch hunter who had given his life to stop the undead king. The reign of Akharekhan had ended. Chapter 25. The Sandstorm Unleashed. The air around the nexus crackled with unrestrained energy, the destruction of the pharaoh's seal unleashing chaos across the battlefield. The ground trembled violently and fissures radiated outward, spewing green fire and ash into the air. Despite the portal's collapse and the apparent victory of the coalition, the undead legions did not crumble as expected. In the center of the chaos, Akharekhan rose to his full height, his skeletal frame battered but unbroken. The green fire of his eyes blazed with unbridled fury, and the remnants of the fragment embedded in his armor pulsed erratically, feeding on the ambient energy of the ley line. "You think this is over?" Akharekhan's voice roared, resonating across the battlefield like a thunderclap. "You have destroyed the seal, but you cannot destroy me. I am eternal." As his voice echoed, the winds began to stir. At first it was a faint breeze, carrying the scent of scorched earth and decay. But within moments it grew into a howling gale, tearing across the battlefield and lifting ash and sand into the air. The remaining soldiers and dwarves braced themselves, their shields raised against the growing storm. Marcus Valor's sacrifice had disrupted the ritual and shattered Akharekhan's connection to the portal, but it had not diminished the Tomb King's resolve. Instead, it had unleashed his desperation and rage, driving him to unleash the full extent of his power. He raised the staff of the Black Sun, its scarab head glowing fiercely, and chanted in the ancient tongue of Nehekhara. The ground beneath his feet blackened, cracks spiderwebbing outward, as the ley line's residual energy was drawn into his spell. The winds intensified, forming a swirling vortex of sand and debris that enveloped Akharekhan. The storm expanded outward, its edges tearing through the ranks of the coalition forces. Soldiers screamed as the sand scoured their armor and flesh, leaving only bones in its wake. The dwarves, stubborn and defiant, stood their ground as long as they could, but even their heavy shields and rune-forged armor offered little protection against the unrelenting fury of the storm. Selena Emberlight, her crimson robes tattered and stained, struggled to maintain her footing as the storm closed in. Her fiery magic had shielded her from the initial onslaught, but even her flames flickered in the face of Akharekhan's overwhelming power. Magnus Craig stumbled toward her, clutching the remnants of his tome. "Selena!" he shouted over the roar of the storm. "We have to stop him, or none of us will leave this place alive." "I know," Selena snapped, her voice strained. She raised her staff, channeling what little magic she had left. A burst of flame shot toward Akharekhan, but the sandstorm swallowed it whole, the fire dissipating into the swirling chaos. At the heart of the storm, Akharekhan stood as a dark god, his voice rising above the tempest. "Your defiance has only delayed the inevitable. This land, this empire, will be buried beneath the sands of eternity." The storm surged outward, engulfing the battlefield and threatening to consume the mountains themselves. Trees were uprooted, rocks shattered into dust, and rivers dried into cracked riverbeds. The once vibrant valley was transformed into a barren wasteland, a testament to Akharekhan's wrath. The remaining coalition forces were scattered, their ranks broken as they sought shelter from the storm. Father Alaric, his warhammer glowing faintly with holy light, stood defiantly in the face of the storm. "Sigmar's light will endure, even in this darkness," he bellowed, but his voice was swallowed by the howling winds. Moments later, he vanished into the maelstrom. Thrain Ironbeard, buttered but unyielding, rallied what remained of his dwarves. "To me, lads!" he roared, his axe cutting through a skeletal warrior that had emerged from the storm. "We'll not fall to some desert wraith. Hold the line." The dwarves formed a shield wall, their runic armor glowing as it resisted the storm's magic. But even their legendary resilience was not enough. The sandstorm's fury broke through their defenses, scattering them like leaves in the wind. As the battlefield descended into chaos, Magnus and Selena found themselves on the edge of the nexus, the storm closing in around them. Magnus clutched the remnants of the Pharaoh seal, its faint glow a flicker of hope amid the destruction. "Selena, the seal!" he shouted, holding it out to her. "We can use it to focus the ley line's energy against him." Selena hesitated, her exhaustion evident. "It's unstable. If we push it too far, it could destroy everything." Magnus met her gaze, his expression grim. "Everything is already falling apart. We have no choice." With a nod, Selena grasped the fragment and raised it high, channeling the ley line's residual energy into the glowing shard. The fragment flared brightly, its light piercing the storm and drawing Akharekhan's attention. The Tomb King turned, his voice a guttural snarl. "You dare challenge me with my own power?" Selena stood firm, the fragment blazing in her hand. "This ends now, Akharekhan. You don't belong here." A surge of energy erupted from the fragment, tearing through the storm and striking Akharekhan. The Tomb King staggered, his skeletal form crackling with unstable magic. The sandstorm faltered, its edges collapsing as the ley line's energy was redirected. But the cost was immense. The fragment shattered in Selena's hand, the resulting shockwave hurling her and Magnus to the ground. The nexus trembled violently, and the remnants of the storm dissipated, leaving the battlefield eerily silent. When the dust settled, Akharekhan stood alone, his form diminished but still defiant. His green-lit eyes flickered weakly as he surveyed the ruined landscape. The coalition forces were broken, scattered across the barren wasteland, but their defiance had disrupted his plans once more. With a final glance at the collapsed nexus, Akharekhan turned and began his retreat into the mountains. The sandstorm had failed to secure his victory, but his wrath remained undiminished. For the survivors, the cost of their stand was steep, but the will of the living had endured. The Empire had faced the storm and survived, at least for now. Chapter 26. The Scholar's Resolve. The survivors of the coalition gathered in the shadow of a jagged ridge, the remnants of their forces weary and bloodied from the devastating sandstorm. The land around them was a desolate wasteland, scarred by the destructive magic of Akharekhan's ritual. Yet, amid the despair, there was a flicker of determination in their ranks. Though battered, they had not broken. Magnus Craig sat hunched over a cracked and weathered tome, the remnants of the pharaoh's seal glowing faintly on the ground before him. His hands trembled as he turned the brittle pages, the text's ancient Nehekhara glyphs glowing faintly in the dim light. Around him the survivors waited, their eyes filled with hope and desperation. "I've found something," Magnus said at last, his voice cutting through the tense silence. He looked up, his spectacles glinting as he addressed the gathered leaders. "Akharekhan's power is tied to the magic of Nehekhara, but that connection can be turned against him." Marcus Voller's second-in-command, Captain Elsa Brower, stepped forward. Her armor was dented and blood-stained, but her resolve was unshaken. "Explain," she said, crossing her arms. "We've thrown everything we have at him, and he's still standing." Magnus adjusted his spectacles, his expression grave but resolute. "Akharekhan's magic relies on anchors, objects or rituals that bind his essence to the mortal plane. The pharaoh's seal was one such anchor, but with its destruction, his connection to this world has grown unstable. He's compensating by drawing directly from the ley line's power." The Usnutesser, Thrain Ironbeard, his axe resting on his shoulder, grunted. "And how do we use that against him, scholar? He's drained the land dry, and his army's still stronger than anything we can throw at him." Magnus gestured to the glowing fragment of the pharaoh's seal. The seal was a focal point for his power, but it also contains the essence of the rituals that sustain him. If we can replicate those rituals and channel their magic back into the ley line, we can sever his connection entirely. Selina Emberlight, leaning heavily on her staff, frowned. You're suggesting we use Nehekhara magic to banish him. You know what that means, Magnus. It's forbidden, dangerous, and unstable." "I know," Magnus admitted. "But we don't have a choice. If we don't stop him here, he'll recover and resume his march. The Empire won't survive another battle like this." The coalition's leaders gathered around Magnus, their expressions a mix of uncertainty and determination. Captain Brower spoke first. "What do you need to make this work?" Magnus took a deep breath, his fingers tracing the edges of the tome. "We need to recreate the ritual Akharekhan used to draw power from the ley line, but in reverse. Instead of stabilizing his connection, we'll disrupt it. Selina, I'll need your magic to amplify the spell. Thrain, your dwarves will need to hold the line against his army." Thrain smirked grimly. "We'll hold it, lad. Don't you worry about that." "And what about Akharekhan himself?" Brower asked, her tone sharp. "He won't stand idly by while we dismantle his power." Magnus hesitated before turning to Selina. "That's where the rest of us come in. While the ritual disrupts his magic, we'll need to keep him occupied. If he realizes what we're doing too soon, he'll destroy us." The bright wizard nodded slowly, though her exhaustion was evident. "It's a risk, but it might work. If we can turn his own power against him, it could be enough." As the coalition regrouped, preparations for the final stand began in earnest. Soldiers sharpened their blades and repaired their armor, their faces set with grim determination. Dwarven engineers worked tirelessly to construct barricades and siege weapons, their stoic focus unshaken despite the devastation around them. Selina and Magnus worked side by side, poring over the ancient text and sketching out the intricate glyphs and incantations required for the ritual. The glowing fragment of the pharaoh's seal served as their guide, its faint light pulsing in time with the ley line's energy. Thrain Ironbeard moved among his kin, rallying the dwarves with gruff encouragement. "This'll be our finest hour, lads. We'll hold the line, no matter what that skeletal fiend throws at us." Captain Brower addressed the gathered soldiers, her voice steady despite the tension. "You've seen what Akharekhan can do. You fought through the storm and survived. Now we finish this. For the Empire." As night fell, the coalition stood ready. The ley line nexus loomed ahead, its fractured stones glowing faintly as residual energy crackled through the air. The ground trembled as Akharekhan's forces approached, their skeletal forms lit by the unholy green fire of their master's magic. Magnus stood at the center of the coalition's formation, the glowing fragment of the seal clutched tightly in his hands. He looked to Selena, who nodded, her staff already glowing with fiery energy. "This is it," Magnus said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "We succeed, or we fall." The coalition's forces braced themselves as the undead legions emerged from the darkness, their ranks endless and unrelenting. Akharekhan strode at their head, his skeletal frame wreathed in swirling sand and green fire. The burning light in his eyes narrowed as he saw the coalition waiting. "Mortals," he intoned, his voice like the grinding of stone, "you persist in your defiance, but this will be your end." Magnus took a deep breath and raised the fragment high. "Not today, Akharekhan." With that, the coalition launched their final stand, and the battle for the ley line began. Chapter 27. The Ritual of Binding. The battlefield at the Nexus was a maelstrom of chaos. Akharekhan's undead legions advanced relentlessly, their skeletal forms moving in perfect synchronization, unyielding in their march. The coalition forces, outnumbered and battered, stood their ground, their ranks fortified by dwarven steel and Sigmarite faith. At the center of the conflict, the Nexus pulsed faintly, its corrupted energy still bleeding into the land. Magnus Krieg and Father Alaric knelt within a hastily constructed circle of runes near the Nexus. Around them, glowing glyphs flickered with unstable energy as the scholar and the Sigmarite priest prepared to perform the ritual that would decide the battle's outcome. Magnus clutched the fragment of the pharaoh's seal tightly, sweat beading on his brow as he muttered the ancient Nehekhara incantations inscribed in his tome. Father Alaric, his golden warhammer resting at his side, joined the chant with prayers to Sigmar, his voice steady and resolute. "This magic was never meant to be wielded by mortals," Magnus said, his voice trembling as he traced the final rune into the earth. "If we lose control—" "We won't," Father Alaric interrupted, his deep voice filled with conviction. "Sigmar guides us, and his light will not falter." The battle raged around them. Dwarves and soldiers held the line against the undead horde, their weapons striking bone and steel with ferocious determination. Selina Emberlight stood atop a rocky outcrop, her staff blazing as she unleashed waves of fire into the enemy ranks. Her magic slowed the advance, but the tide of the undead seemed endless. In the distance, Akharekhan strode through the chaos, his burning eyes fixed on the Nexus, the fractured glow of the ley line reflected in his skeletal form, and the fragment embedded in his chest pulsed erratically. The Tomb King's voice boomed across the battlefield, a cold, commanding chant in the tongue of Nehekhara. "You cannot bind me, mortals," Akharekhan declared, his staff raised high. "I am the master of eternity, and you are but fleeting sparks in the sandstorm of time." Magnus's voice rose, defying the Tomb King's proclamation. "Your eternity is a lie, Akharekhan. It was built on betrayal, and it ends here." As Magnus and Father Alaric activated the ritual, the runes surrounding them flared brightly, their golden glow contrasting with the sickly green light of the Nexus. The air vibrated with raw energy, and a faint hum echoed across the battlefield, growing louder with each passing moment. The fragment of the pharaoh's seal in Magnus's hands began to glow intensely, its power resonating with the ley line's energy. Akharekhan froze mid-stride, his skeletal form trembling as the magic of the ritual took hold. His burning eyes flared brighter, and his voice faltered as flashes of memory overwhelmed him. In his mind, Akharekhan stood once more in the sunlit deserts of Nehekhara. He saw the golden pyramids of his kingdom rising against the horizon, their intricate carvings glinting in the blazing light. The sound of priests chanting his name echoed through the air, and the weight of his crown pressed reassuringly on his brow. But the vision was not pure. Shadows crept into the edges of his memory, distorting the perfect image of his kingdom. He saw Awoke, his trusted general, kneeling before him with a false smile. He felt again the searing betrayal as he was bound and entombed, the mocking laughter of his enemies ringing in his ears. Akharekhan muttered, his voice tinged with a flicker of doubt. This is not how it was. The vision shifted again. The sands of Nehekhara became pale and lifeless, the pyramids crumbling into ruins. His people were gone, their bones scattered across the dunes, forgotten by the living world. The grandeur he had fought to preserve was nothing more than dust, carried away by the unyielding wind. On the battlefield, Akharekhan staggered, his movements sluggish as the ritual intensified. The magic binding him to the mortal plane began to unravel, the ley line's energy flowing away from him and back into the earth. The fragment of the pharaoh's seal embedded in his chest dimmed, its power siphoned into the ritual's glyphs. "Keep going," Magnus shouted, his voice strained as he struggled to maintain the incantation. "He's weakening." Father Alaric raised his warhammer, its golden glow intensifying as he invoked Sigmar's name. "By the light of the God King, let this abomination be cast into the void." Akharekhan roared, his skeletal form trembling as he fought against the ritual's pull. The memories of his kingdom, his betrayal, and his fall flooded his mind, weakening his focus. The rage that had driven him for centuries now gave way to something deeper. Sorrow, longing, and the crushing realization that his glory was gone, never to return. "You cannot take this from me," Akharekhan bellowed, his voice filled with desperation. "Nehekhara is mine. I am its king." But the ritual's magic did not falter. The coalition's forces pressed their advantage, pushing the undead legions back as the Tomb King's connection to his army grew weaker. Selena unleashed a final torrent of fire, carving a path through the skeletal ranks and clearing the way to the Nexus. Magnus and Father Alaric chanted the final words of the ritual, their voices blending as the glyphs flared one last time. A surge of energy erupted from the fragment of the pharaoh's seal, engulfing Akharekhan in a blinding pillar of light. The Tomb King's skeletal form twisted and writhed within the light, his staff and scimitar falling to the ground. His voice echoed across the battlefield, a mix of rage and anguish before fading into silence. When the light subsided, Akharekhan was gone. The Nexus lay dormant, its corrupted energy cleansed, and the undead army collapsed into lifeless heaps of bone and ash. The battlefield fell silent, save for the labored breathing of the coalition's survivors. Magnus collapsed to his knees, the fragment of the pharaoh's seal now a dull, lifeless shard in his trembling hands. Father Alaric placed a steady hand on his shoulder, his voice calm and resolute. "You've done it, Magnus. The Empire endures." Magnus looked out at the ruins of the battlefield, his face etched with exhaustion and relief. "For now," he murmured. "But the cost?" As the first rays of dawn broke over the mountains, the survivors began to regroup, their victory hard-won but undeniable. Akharekhan was gone, his ambition undone by the very magic he had sought to master. Chapter 28. The Tomb King's Fury. The leyline nexus trembled violently, the earth beneath it cracking as the remnants of Akharekhan's power surged into the unstable magic. The air was thick with the acrid scent of death and burning magic, and the battlefield roared with the clash of steel, the cries of the living, and the relentless clatter of skeletal warriors. But now, amidst the chaos, an ominous shift occurred. Akharekhan's fury erupted, unbound and all-consuming. At the center of the battlefield, the towering skeletal figure of Akharekhan glowed with an otherworldly light. The fragment of the pharaoh's seal, though weakened by the ritual, pulsed erratically with residual power, amplifying his magic to catastrophic levels. His burning green eyes surveyed the coalition forces, and his voice boomed like thunder across the plateau. "You think to defy a king of Nehekhara? You will learn that eternity bends to my will." Raising the staff of the Black Sun, Akharekhan unleashed a massive wave of necromantic energy. The ground erupted in a plume of green fire, sending shockwaves across the battlefield. Coalition soldiers were flung aside like leaves in a gale, their armor shattered and weapons broken. Dwarven ranks holding the line were scattered, their sturdy formations faltering under the force of the blast. Selena Emberlight, the bright wizard, stood atop a jagged outcrop, her staff ablaze as she conjured torrents of fire to hold back the undead legions. She turned her focus to Akharekhan, hurling a massive fireball toward him, its heat searing the air. The flames struck the Tomb King directly, engulfing his skeletal form in a blazing inferno. For a brief moment, the battlefield held its breath, but Akharekhan strode through the flames unharmed, his green-lit eyes narrowing on Selena. "You dare wield fire against the sun?" he roared, his voice filled with contempt. With a sweep of his staff, a column of sand and magic surged toward the bright wizard, striking her with devastating force. Selena was thrown backward, her staff clattering to the ground as she collapsed in a heap. Smoke curled from her robes, and her breathing was labored. Magnus Craig rushed to her side, shielding her from the encroaching undead with what little strength he could muster. Meanwhile, Father Alaric led a contingent of militia into the fray, his warhammer glowing with holy light as he struck down undead warriors with righteous fury. His prayers to Sigmar echoed across the battlefield, bolstering the resolve of those around him. But Akharekhan's focus turned to the priest, his burning gaze locking onto the golden warhammer. "Your god's light is but a flicker in the face of my wrath," the Tomb King intoned. With a sharp gesture, Akharekhan summoned a swarm of spectral scarabs, their chittering cries rising as they descended upon Alaric and his men. The priest swung his warhammer valiantly, his holy magic scattering the creatures, but they overwhelmed his soldiers, tearing through their ranks. As the last of his contingent fell, Father Alaric stood alone, his glowing hammer raised high. "Sigmar's light will endure," he bellowed. Akharak raised his scimitar, its edge glowing with molten energy. "Your light dies here, priest." The scimitar's strike was blinding, cutting through Alaric's defenses and felling the priest in a burst of unholy fire. His warhammer fell to the ground, its glow fading as the coalition forces recoiled in shock at the loss of their spiritual leader. Thrain Ironbeard, enraged by the priest's fall, charged at Akharekhan with a contingent of dwarves. "You've slain enough of my kin, you cursed skeleton," he roared, his rune-etched axe gleaming as he swung with all his might. Akharak parried the strike with his staff, the force of the impact sending tremors through the ground. The two clashed in a brutal melee, the ancient magic of Nehekhara against the unyielding strength of the dwarves. Thrain's axe struck true, carving through Akharekhan's armor and sending fragments of bone scattering. But the Tomb King retaliated with a devastating pulse of magic, throwing the dwarf lord and his warriors to the ground. Thrain rose slowly, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "You'll have to do better than that," he growled, gripping his axe tightly. Akharekhan's eyes flared with green fire. "You are an insect before the storm." With a wave of his staff, he summoned a massive sand construct, its towering form crashing into the dwarven line. Thrain and his warriors fought valiantly, but the construct's crushing blows and Akharekhan's relentless magic drove them back. Amid the carnage, Marcus Voller emerged, his silvered sword gleaming in the corrupted light. He had seen the fall of his comrades, and the weight of their sacrifice burned within him. Gritting his teeth, he pushed forward, carving his way through the skeletal ranks toward Akharekhan. As the witch hunter neared, Akharekhan turned to face him, his scimitar raised. "You seek to challenge me, mortal? Your defiance is futile." Valar tightened his grip on his sword, his voice steady. "You've taken enough lives, Akharekhan. It ends now." The two clashed in a duel of ferocious intensity. Voller's strikes were swift and precise, his blade finding purchase in the cracks of Akharekhan's ancient armor. But the Tomb King's might was overwhelming, his counterattacks forcing Voller onto the defensive. Akharekhan's scimitar slashed across Valor's side, and the witch hunter staggered, blood staining his coat. Yet, despite his injuries, he refused to yield. With a cry of defiance, he drove his blade into Akharekhan's chest, striking the fragment of the pharaoh's seal. The impact sent a shock wave through the battlefield, and both combatants were thrown apart. Akharekhan staggered, his skeletal form trembling as the seal's energy surged erratically. Voller fell to the ground, his wounds severe, but his eyes remained fixed on the Tomb King. Though battered and diminished, Akharekhan stood tall, his fury undiminished. "You cannot stop me," he roared, his voice shaking the earth. "I am the master of eternity. You are nothing but dust beneath my feet." But as the battle raged on, the coalition forces, though weakened, began to rally. Inspired by the sacrifices of their fallen comrades, they pushed forward, their resolve unbroken. The final stand had begun, and the fate of the Empire rested on their shoulders. Chapter 29. The Portal's Collapse. The battlefield trembled violently as the ritual's final incantations echoed across the leyline nexus. The glowing glyphs that Magnus Craig and Father Alaric had inscribed into the ground flared with blinding light, their energy surging into the fractured portal. The swirling vortex above the nexus, once stable and glowing with the golden sands of Nehekhara, began to fracture, its edges splintering like shattered glass. Akharekhan, battered but unyielding, stood at the center of the chaos. His skeletal form radiated fury, the fragment of the pharaoh's seal in his chest pulsating wildly as the unstable portal drained its power. His green-lit eyes burned brighter than ever, his voice rising above the deafening roar of collapsing magic. "You think you have won," Akharekhan roared, raising the staff of the Black Sun. "Even now my kingdom calls to me. You cannot undo the will of Nehekhara." The ground beneath him split open, geysers of green fire erupting as the nexus unraveled. His skeletal legions, weakened by the coalition's relentless assault, faltered as the magic sustaining them began to dissipate. The undead constructs collapsed in heaps of bone and rusted metal, their glowing eyes extinguished. Magnus knelt within the glowing circle of runes, the remains of the pharaoh's seal clutched in his trembling hands. The artifact's light flickered erratically, mirroring the instability of the portal above. Selina Emberlight, leaning heavily on her staff, stood beside him, her fiery magic feeding into the ritual's final push. "It's working," Magnus shouted, his voice strained. "The portal is collapsing, but we need more power to sever his connection completely." Selina nodded, her face pale with exhaustion. "I'll give it everything I have," she said, her voice barely audible. She raised her staff, a torrent of fire erupting from its tip and channeling into the runes. The flames merged with the glyphs, intensifying their glow as they drew the ley line's energy into the ritual. Akharekhan staggered as the collapsing portal disrupted the flow of magic that bound him to the mortal realm. The fragment of the pharaoh's seal in his chest cracked, green light spilling from the fissures. His once commanding presence wavered, and his movements became erratic, as if the forces sustaining him were slipping away. "Now Vibrin," Akharekhan bellowed, his voice a mixture of rage and desperation. "I am eternal. My kingdom will rise again." Marcus Valere, bloodied and barely able to stand, gripped his sword tightly as he staggered toward the faltering Tomb King. "Your kingdom is gone, Akharekhan," he said, his voice low but resolute. "It's time you joined it." With a final surge of strength, Voller lunged forward, driving his silvered blade into the fragment of the pharaoh's seal. The impact shattered the fragment completely, unleashing a shockwave of raw magic that engulfed the nexus. The portal above erupted in a blinding explosion of light, its swirling vortex collapsing inward as the ley line's energy surged uncontrollably. The image of Nehekhara faded, replaced by an expanding void that consumed the remnants of the portal. Akharekhan's skeletal form convulsed, his scimitar falling to the ground. "No!" Akharekhan cried, his voice echoing with anguish. "I will not be forgotten. I am Akharekhan. I am—" His words were cut short as the magic binding his soul unraveled. His skeletal body disintegrated, reduced to ash that scattered in the swirling winds. The ground beneath the nexus stabilized, the cracks sealing as the ley line's energy receded into the earth. As the dust settled, the battlefield grew silent. The remaining undead collapsed lifelessly, their glowing eyes extinguished as Akharekhan's soul was banished back to his shattered tomb. The coalition forces, battered and bloodied, stood in stunned silence, the weight of their hard-won victory sinking in. Magnus fell to his knees, the remains of the pharaoh's seal crumbling to dust in his hands. Selena collapsed beside him, her staff clattering to the ground as exhaustion overtook her. Around them, the surviving soldiers and dwarves began to cheer, their voices rising in a triumphant chorus. Threen Ironbeard, leaning heavily on his axe, surveyed the battlefield with grim satisfaction. "The cursed skeleton's gone," he muttered. "Good riddance." Captain Elsa Brower, her armor dented but her spirit unbroken, approached Magnus and Selina. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with awe. "The Empire owes you both a debt it can never repay." As the sun rose over the gray mountains, its light revealed the devastation left in the wake of Akharekhan's fury. The land was scarred, the nexus a smoldering ruin. But the Empire had endured. The coalition began tending to their wounded, their victory tempered by the losses they had suffered. Magnus stared at the horizon, his expression a mixture of relief and sorrow. "It's over," he said softly. "But at what cost?" Selina placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice steady despite her weariness. "The cost was high, Magnus. But thanks to you, the Empire still stands." In the distance, the ashes of Akharekhan's form were carried away by the wind, scattered across the barren wasteland he had tried to claim. His ambition had been undone, his soul banished to the silence of his tomb. The reign of the Tomb King had ended, and the Empire's hard-fought victory would be remembered for generations to come. Chapter 30. The Aftermath. The battlefield was quiet now, the echoes of battle replaced by the mournful wind that swept across the scarred landscape. The ley line nexus, once the center of Akharekhan's dark power, lay dormant and shattered, its ancient stones cracked and blackened. The once fertile land surrounding the nexus had become a barren wasteland, the earth scorched and lifeless. The survivors of the coalition moved slowly through the devastation, their faces etched with exhaustion and grief. Dwarves carried their fallen kin on makeshift stretchers, their expressions grim but resolute. Empire soldiers gathered what little remained of their forces, tending to the wounded and murmuring prayers for those who had given their lives. Magnus Craig sat on a large stone near the remnants of the nexus, his hands trembling as he clutched his ruined tome. The pages were charred and crumbling, the knowledge within reduced to fragments by the intensity of the battle. He stared at the smoldering horizon, his mind heavy with the weight of what had been achieved and what had been lost. Selina Emberlight approached, her staff now little more than a charred husk in her hand. She lowered herself onto the stone beside him, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. "You did it, Magnus," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "We all did." Magnus shook his head slowly, his voice filled with doubt. "At what cost, Selina? Look around you. The land is ruined, our forces decimated. Valor, Alaric, Thrain, so many gone. And for what? To stop a king who will return someday, just as they always do." Selina placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm despite her fatigue. "We stopped him today, and we gave the Empire a chance to rebuild. That's what matters. In the center of the battlefield, the surviving leaders gathered to reflect on their hard-won victory. Captain Elsa Brower stood with the remnants of her company, her armor battered, but her voice steady as she addressed the soldiers. "We fought for the living," she said, her tone resolute. "We fought for those who could not defend themselves. And though we have lost much, we have shown the strength of the Empire. Remember that, even as we mourn." Nearby, the dwarves of Akharekhan gathered around a small cairn of stones, a makeshift memorial to Thrain Ironbeard and their fallen comrades. A young dwarf warrior stepped forward, his voice breaking as he spoke. "Thrain gave his life so we could see this day. He'll be remembered as the hero he was, alongside every dwarf who stood with him." The others nodded, their solemn expressions a testament to their grief and pride. As the sun set over the gray mountains, the survivors began their journey back to their homelands. The road was long and fraught with reminders of the battle, the scorched earth, the ruined nexus, and the countless graves that marked their path. Yet, they carried with them a sense of unity forged in the crucible of battle. Magnus and Selena walked together, the weight of their journey evident in their tired steps. "Do you think it's truly over?" Selena asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Magnus glanced at her, his expression grim. "For now, perhaps, but Akharekhan's tomb remains, buried beneath the sands of Nehekhara, and as long as it exists, there's a chance he'll rise again." Selena's gaze hardened, determination replacing her weariness. "Then we'll be ready. The Empire will stand no matter what comes." In the distant deserts of Nehekhara, far from the gray mountains and the lands of the Empire, the sands shifted in the moonlight. Akharekhan's shattered tomb, buried beneath centuries of sand, lay silent and still. But deep within its depths, a faint green light pulsed weakly, its rhythm slow but unbroken. The whispers of Akharekhan's name faded into the night wind, a reminder that the legacy of the Tomb Kings was never truly extinguished. The sands of time had reclaimed him for now, but the shadow of his ambition lingered, waiting for the day it would rise again. And so the Empire endured, scarred but unbroken. The battle against Akharekhan would pass into legend, a tale of sacrifice and resilience, told around fires and in great halls. Though the future remained uncertain, the survivors carried the memory of their victory and the resolve to face whatever darkness might come.